Here's your quote. Thomas Pynchon loved this book almost as much as he loves cameras. Hey, over here, have your picture taken with a reclusive author. Today only, we'll throw in a free autograph. But wait, there's more.
But it is a curve each of them feels, unmistakably. It is the parabola. They must have guessed, once or twice, guessed and refused to believe that everything, always, collectively, had been moving toward that purified shape latent in the sky. That shape of no surprise, no second chances, no return. Yet they do move forever under it, reserved for its own black and white bad news, certainly as if it were the rainbow, and they, its children. Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I have the privilege, the honor, the joy to be able to share with you my thoughts about Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. This is, without a doubt, one of my absolute favorite books. It has been ever since the first time I read it over 10 years ago. At that time, I made it about halfway before consulting Stephen Weisenburger's great companion, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. But just in general, this is a book that can be enjoyed on so many different levels. I mean, it's absolutely packed. The way that I feel about it the second time reading is that it is yet again one of these books that's made to kind of go against the economic law of diminishing marginal utility, which states that each time a consumer consumes some good or service, the pleasure they get or the reward they get begins to diminish with each successive consumption. So this is why movies become more and more violent, for example, because as consumers who love these violent movies continue to consume, they start to become desensitized and the enjoyment they get starts to diminish. So the movies have to get more and more violent to try and offer more and more. Gravity's Rainbow somehow goes against that and gets better. You get more and more return on investment each time you read it. So I already can't wait to read it again. Really, every sentence is like a research project. And for those who have read it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, even the what is seemingly the most just sort of throwaway or bland sentence is actually packed with multiple levels of meaning. And yeah, it's just every sentence is a research project. What I really hope to do with this video is, first of all, to whet the appetites of would-be readers and give you something that might entice you to take the plunge. I want to also convince those who have abandoned the novel and swore they'd never read it again to perhaps give it another try. For those who have read it once, I want to give you enough to interest you to read it again. And for those longtime diehard Pynchon fans, the fan who has read Gravity's Rainbow 8+ times, I hope that I will have dug up some new gem or morsel or novelty for you to take a look at. I want to start by giving 10 assertions about Gravity's Rainbow. I think that I was inspired by Heather Cass White's recent book, Books Promiscuously Read, which I highly recommend and which I wrote a review for that'll be coming out in Rain Taxi. But she starts off with these propositions or assertions, and I want to sort of follow suit for this video. So number one, William Gaddis's 1955 The Recognitions is truly the beginning of the maximalist encyclopedic novel in 20th century American literature. But it will forever be Thomas Pynchon's 1973 Gravity's Rainbow that is the emblem of an era. Number two, the merits of Gravity's Rainbow are completely indisputable at this point, regardless of what the trustees and the advisory board of the 1974 Pulitzer Committee had to say about it. Number 3, there is indeed a structure or multiple structures that organize the text. Number 4, at the core, this plot is just your typical quest, hero's quest. However, that quest sort of proliferates throughout all of the different characters and becomes many, many, many different interconnected quests. Number 5, and like I already said at the beginning of the video, Gravity's Rainbow cannot help but reward the interest and effort of its readers. Number 6, no matter what I could say about it in this entire video, you cannot spoil Gravity's Rainbow for would-be readers. Number 7, though it shares themes with other maximalist novels, entropy, indeterminacy, interconnectedness, cybernetics, there's still nothing like Gravity's Rainbow. To quote Harold Bloom in his book, The Western Canon, the first time you read Gravity's Rainbow, you encounter a startlement, an uncanny upending of expectations rather than satisfaction and fulfillment. And this is, in fact, a good quality. Number 9, it is so densely packed, so multi-layered, so architected like that of a Mozart or a Bach piece that it leads even the most conservative and punctilious of scholars into fits of overreach. And number 10, your enthusiasm for it cannot overreach. In an effort to continue to entice would-be readers and potential rereaders, I want to read just a few passages from Catherine Hume's book, Pynchon's Mythography, An Approach to Gravity's Rainbow. I'll be talking about this more in my literature review section coming up. But listen to how she states it. This is perfect. She says, "We must remember that the concerns and responses of readers change as they grow familiar with the text of Gravity's Rainbow. Interpreters who stress the radical fragmentation of everything and the total postmodernism of Pynchon dedicate themselves to preserving the reader's reaction to a first reading." And she makes a solid point. This is what we hear most about when it comes to Gravity's Rainbow. And the people you're hearing that from, they're referring to those initial readings. But she goes on, "Gravity's Rainbow, however, invites rereading. During subsequent perusals, the reader is likely to feel triumph at piecing fragments together into larger patterns, pleasure at remembering characters and places, and at being now able to connect them to major plot lines. We no longer worry that we cannot tie everything into a neat system." And that's something that a lot of first-time readers, even second-time readers, they grapple with, because our mind, of course, wants to organize chaos. We want to make structure and organization from chaos. And so we try to do that with Gravity's Rainbow, and first efforts with it will frustrate that facility that we have within us. But we will feel increasingly comfortable with the text as we continue to read it, and we will move from one episode to the next, focusing on each as it comes. We can simply enjoy the slapstick, the weird fantasy, the realistic detail, the changes in narrative register, and the deliberate mysteries. We reach a state corresponding to that of Pynchon's new style of hero. Like Pynchon's heroes facing their fragmented cosmos, we learn to survive through flexibility and through not demanding too much control. As familiarity increases, the text starts to establish links in each reader's mind to the broader literary tradition. Literary and cultural relationships establish themselves to Faust, to Moby Dick, to Ulysses, to Wagner, and to the Bible, as well as to the films of Fritz Lang and to King Kong. If we read the text only once, the disruptive and disquieting features will retain most of their pristine force. The sense of near total otherness will be our strongest response to a kind of defamiliarization that does not just slow down our regard until it sees the stoniness of the stone, but pulverizes the stone itself. And that talk about the stone, the animation of the stone, comes from Gravity's Rainbow. Subsequent readings are what do most to make the text more open to us and make us more open to the text. We circumvent the brain's longing for, this is great. We circumvent the brain's longing for closure enough to let the two modes of reception resonate with and against each other. So this is a dialectic of reader response. Trying to reach this state for reading Gravity's Rainbow seems appropriate because observing the human desire for order and its struggle with an uncertain reality is partly what Gravity's Rainbow is about. And so in the reader or critic, they, meaning the two modes, that dialectic of reading, they produce a reading, an interaction between text and reader, richer and more full of the sensation of meaning, even more creative than either mode can produce alone. The state of mind that permits the two modes of perception to coincide is playful and revels in the permutations without trying to pin them rigidly down. It encourages a Barthesian, meaning Roland Barthes, Barthesian jouissance in the open and relaxed reader, who can accept Pynchon's entire circus of effects without needing desperately to control them. So, to sum it all up, just relax and be open and take in Gravity's Rainbow. If this is your first time, I would advise getting Weisenburger's book, The Companion, and just use it to, at the beginning of each of Gravity's Rainbow's episodes, just read Weisenburger's summation of what's going on in there. There's a paragraph or sometimes a page or two before each episode and before each section of the four sections of the book where he explains what's going on in this episode. And it's a good way to orient yourself so that you at least have the basic orientation if you find yourself completely bewildered just trying to take the text on its own the first time. But like Hume is saying, it's teaching us a new way to read. And this is what I said in my review, especially of Gaddis's J.R. He's teaching you how to hear a novel more than read a novel, which is really interesting. But there requires a different type of reading for books like this. And I promise you that if you let it operate on you and mold you instead of you trying to operate on the book and mold it into what you want it to be, it will make you a better reader. So many people out there have something to say about Gravity's Rainbow. It's just one of those books. It's like, with Infinite Jest, everybody has things, everybody who has grappled with it, either to reject it or to embrace it, whatever. And it just seems to spin up this factory of ideas and assertions, opinions, and so on. So this is even more with Gravity's Rainbow, which has been out for decades longer than Infinite Jest. And in fact, I think I see a link between the nodes of the recognitions to Gravity's Rainbow to Infinite Jest. But anyhow, if you have a link to an article or if you yourself have a podcast, whatever, please feel free to post it below. You can use this video, use the comments. If for some reason it doesn't let you post, just send me a message, an email or whatever, and I'll make sure it gets posted in there. Don't feel afraid at all to plug what you have about Gravity's Rainbow. Now I'm going to attempt to do something that's sort of impossible. And I thought about writing this out, but I decided to just try and do it extemporaneously. Just try and do this off the cuff. But what is Gravity's Rainbow about? What is it really about? This is something that, as I've been immersed in Gravity's Rainbow for the whole summer, and people have seen me reading it, or people have asked me what I'm reading now. They always want to know, I've heard of that, or maybe they haven't. What is it really about? And they don't mean the plot. I'll try that in a moment. But what is it about? So here are some typical answers that I give. The first one goes something like this. It's about sort of the end of World War II, and Pynchon, he's trying to figure out, on the one hand, there's a rocket, it's the V2, it was a real rocket, and he did a lot of research, and And you get the point. So that's usually how it comes out. And then people have lost, my interlocutor has lost interest by then. But seriously, what do I think it's about? Well, I think it is about Pynchon trying to get into the mind of the 20th century German and trying to understand how this could have happened, how the Holocaust could have come to be. And interestingly, you'll see that Hitler, the Holocaust, they're only sort of glanced at. What he really focuses in on is the 9 months spanning 1944 into 1945, sort of the end of World War II, and now the dismantling of Germany, the partitioning of Germany between the Allies, Nazis who are fleeing to South America. And it's very much about the V2 or A4 rocket, which was just this marvel of rocketry. And in fact, had Hitler not had this dream that the A4 would not be able to fly and then turn around and withdraw funding for 2 or 3 years or however long it was, if that dream and Hitler's mania had not happened, things could be very, very different now. One of the principal sources from Pynchon is Dornberger's book, V2. And I actually sought out a paperback and paid an arm and a leg for it because it's just so fascinating. But, Pynchon wants to understand, on the one hand, what this rocket really symbolizes. He gets into the German mind that's obsessed with transcending our Earth and going to the stars and to other planets. But at the same time, whereas there's this transcendence upward, there's also this transcendence downward. So toward the zero and toward the one. And, something that could be used for space exploration and for furthering humanity's horizons could also be used for such horrific acts that are tied into the Lebensraum, or the German obsession at the time with land, with just conquering more and more land because it's some sort of divinely appointed to them. So Pynchon is trying to get into the mindset, and he starts from way back in Teutonic mythology and goes all the way through the 20th century German culture. I mean, this is meticulously and exhaustively researched by Pynchon and brought into the book, and it goes from high to low. So German rocket scientists, German behaviorists, Pavlov chiefly, German cinema, Fritz Lang, and other silent movies of the time. Fritz Lang's The Woman in the Moon, Die Frau im Munde, I think. You can watch it on YouTube, actually. This was where Fritz Lang really captured the German fascination with rocketry. And this was also a film that in real life, the rocket man, or Raketenmensch, Werner von Braun, who would, in an amazing twist of fate and just this layered irony, would become part of America's team of scientists to get us to the moon. He was one of the chief workers in Peenemünde and working for Hitler to create these weapons of mass destruction. But, he watched Werner von Braun. It's amazing to go onto YouTube now and watch this Fritz Lang movie that von Braun certainly watched. And it piqued even more his fascination with the rocket. So circling way back to what is this about? In large part, it is about understanding how a culture, how the conditions of culture from back in mythological times all the way through the popular culture of the day led into this mindset that could be utilized by them. We'll talk more about that as we go on, to have such devastating results. And of course, when I try to just give that one statement about what this book is or tries to do, I've lost my audience by 9 times out of 10. So what's the plot? Okay. At its most basic, and most people know this, but it's about this American lieutenant, Slothrop, Tyrone Slothrop from Massachusetts, and this character is modeled somewhat on Pynchon himself. In the novel, Slothrop has an ancestor in New England who sort of publishes a tractate that goes against the Calvinist-infused idea of the elect versus the preterite. And that actually happened in real life with one of Pynchon's ancestors, William Pynchon. So it's really interesting to see those parallels there. But anyway, Slothrop is our main character. He's our hero. He is on a quest. He is supposed to be assigned to going and studying V2 rockets and gathering as much intel as he can, going to these sites where they've exploded, and just gathering this intel and giving it back to a London-based institution called the White Visitation. There are endless symbolical levels I could go with that, but I'm going to try to stick to this plot. However, during the course of this, we see that they have utilized Slothrop mainly because he has this really interesting behavioral pattern where his erections, or rather his sexual conquests as sort of a result or concomitantly with his erections, coincide with V2 explosion sites in Blitzkrieg, London. In fact, literally in the book, the two map onto each other into what's called a Poisson distribution. And Poisson distribution, as we'll talk about in a little bit, is perfect for Pynchon and what he's getting at, because it brings together into one event, one mathematical explanation, both free will and determinism, because there's no real causal linkage between all the different sites. They're just random, but at the same time, they are showing a mathematical pattern, which is incredible. And furthermore, it maps onto Slothrop's erections. So anyway, in the course of him doing all this research and people, all around him sort of controlling it, it's almost got this sort of Truman Show feel where people are orchestrating things, filming things, doing espionage, keeping an eye on Slothrop, guiding him, making him think it's his own free will, but it's really they're determining his course here. In the course of it, he starts to have this revelation that there's something about the V2 and his psychological makeup and his psychophysiological makeup, his psychosomatic responses, namely the erections. And he realizes that this is something he needs to look into. And so he deviates from the course that he's been assigned to, and he starts chasing down all of this intel, and he's all over the place. And he realizes that when he was a child, his father sold him to this German juggernaut, bureaucratic juggernaut, this cartel, IG Farben, so that they could do experimentation on him in exchange for paying for his Harvard education later in life. And he realizes there's this sort of plastic that's been used that's referred to as Imipex G. And this plastic was used to condition him as an infant. So beyond his control. And the more he learns about that, the more we're led with him, and we see the interconnectedness of everything. And it all points back to this rocket. That is the most basic plot. And the best I can do now is to move into the literature review section, and we'll start to fill in vast abysses or chasms that I've left wide open by giving that very rudimentary plot. Welcome to the literature review. I'm going to just go through some highlights of all the secondary criticism I read around my second reading of Gravity's Rainbow. First off is the mandatory companion from Stephen C. Weisenburger, Gravity's Rainbow Companion. This has been updated. He has basically done what Stephen Moore has done for William Gaddis. I love that right in the introduction, he gives us this awesome tidbit. The first draft of Gravity's Rainbow was written out in neat, tiny script on engineer's quadrille paper or graph paper. I mean, just really imagine if you hold this hefty text, and I only have ever had this deluxe Penguin paperback, but you can feel the heft of it, even though other books are physically bigger. The way this one's made, you can just feel the weight of it. There's so much packed into it. But just to think about at that time in the 60s and early 70s, Thomas Pynchon drafting this in longhand on graph paper. It just, I mean, certainly this happened during his time working for Boeing, actually studying rockets and writing technical requirements, technical specifications, and different stuff like that in Washington State. I mean, this is just so perfectly goes together. Weisenburger talks about how there was a remarkable flap over the Pulitzer Awards, with judges so sharply divided against trustees over the book that no award in fiction was given. And that is the only year, and still is the only year, that has ever happened. So Gravity's Rainbow came in and basically jammed the machinery of this awards assembly and this institution. He talks about how Pynchon builds up networks of detail. That is what he calls one key aspect of Thomas Pynchon's style and his creative technique. And that is so true, sort of like what I said earlier about how each sentence seems like its own research project. Really what he's doing is he's building up networks of details. And you'll get to the point where even in the times when you're not reading Gravity's Rainbow and you're just kind of thinking on it, you will start to see how so many points bring up so many other points, and how well done it is. It can sound easy. It can sometimes sound like, oh, anybody could just go and just, regurgitate all the nonfiction that they're reading at the time. It doesn't quite work like that, because Pynchon has still given us a crafted work of art, and it's so hard to do. There are many instances where marginal footnoted material is transmuted into fictional reference and event. Basically what I was just trying to say, but more eloquently stated by Weisenburger. One of his main sources was the Times of London, and collectively they enable one to pinpoint the story time of many episodes, sometimes to within the hour. And even when we get to our analysis of the first episode, we'll talk a little bit about that. But yeah, he meticulously went through reading the major newspaper of the time to get the setting and the different events just right. I mean, down to the weather of the day. Against the novel's critics, there is thus a great deal more to be said about the politics and morality of its fiction making. And Weisenburger would go on, and we'll talk about this here in just a few books, but Gravity's Rainbow, Domination, and Freedom is the book that he would write many, many years later and expand on that. This is the shape of Gravity's Rainbow, a mandala. Its 4 quadrants marked by crucial dates on the Christian liturgical calendar that traces a motion in which the circle of redemptive death, or foolishness, read it however you will, is nearly closed. And if this doesn't do anything else, one thing it does do is to show, like I said, that structure, how Pynchon does organize using a tarot deck to a degree, and a lot of people know about that, but really not so much. I mean, there is the coincidence of the number of cards in a deck and a number of episodes in the opening episode and things like that. And there's a reading or a little bit, there's a full reading of one character's tarot reading, but then the other one's left pretty much wide open. But to a much more marked degree, it's organized around, like Weisenburger says, the Christian liturgical calendar, and how it actually maps up with pagan events is actually very, very convincing. And there's no question that Pynchon did organize this explicitly the way that Weisenburger has dug up and excavated and polished off for us. Gravity's rainbow unfolds over 9 months, 3/4 of a solar year. The narrative approaches but avoids closure. It's got that asymptotic quality to it. Frederick R. Karl's 2 books on American fictions. This is the 1940 to 1980. These are indispensable books. But I'm just going to look at the section on Pynchon and Barth. As for Pynchon, Gravity's Rainbow, whatever failings it may have as literature, has become the Ulysses of the 70s. A work whose difficulties, abstruse references, and historical sweep recall Joyce's plan of the 20s. The rocket falls. We have pieces, and then we must fit the rocket together to regain the novel. The mode for Pynchon is dismemberment. And there are 2 things he's getting at in that. When he says that the rocket falls and we must fit the rocket together, Enzian, who is our black Herero leader of the Schwarzkommando, the Black Command. This is comprised of people who were oppressed in the early 20th century. This is real history. In 1904, General von Trotta of the Germans went and colonized the German Südwest in Africa, and the Herero peoples were nearly completely annihilated at the hands of the Germans. Well, now this character, Enzian, is leading a group of the Herero Schwarzkommand, and they are literally going through the zone in post-war Europe and reassembling a new V2 rocket from parts. And then when he says that the mode for Pynchon is dismemberment, you will see that based on entropy, things start to wind down and fragment as we go on, including Slothrop himself as a physical being, which is an amazing feat in this fiction to pull that off the way that Pynchon does. This novel of seemingly endless chaos is, in reality, tightly organized. Hence one of my assertions that it really does have structure. Though not the first introduction of imitation into the novel, Slothrop, in fact, can be viewed as a forgery in his own right. It does suggest that Pynchon is picking up Gaddis's theme in the recognitions. And a lot of people for a while even speculated that William Gaddis and Thomas Pynchon were the same person, or that, Pynchon basically borrowed heavily from Gaddis. However, I would recommend Stephen Moore's essay, Parallel, Not Series, in my back pages. That title actually comes from the character Lenny Pokler in Gravity's Rainbow, and he's making the point that, these guys are writing in parallel. It's not Gaddis got this out and then Pynchon, borrowed from it. And Stephen Moore in that essay, more than anybody else I've read, really does take this comparison of Pynchon and Gaddis seriously and sort of sets it all out there for us to see where they could have, borrowed from each other, but there are no real grounds for it. Working all sides of the monologue and dialogue is Pynchon, the self-conscious, intruding author, unable to leave his artifact alone for more than moments, bubbling with commentary, one-lines, words directed at both characters and audience. And there are really narrators in this, because there are moments when a narrator sort of comments on a narrator. It's not quite to the degree of the overt or highly self-aware and designed meta commentary of an Italo Calvino or like Don Quixote. It's done more like Pynchon employs it in this manner where it's almost natural, almost like this is how you're supposed to write a novel. It's interesting. Only Byron the Bulb, who can slip outside the system, will survive, but he must do so at great personal cost. The story of Byron the Bulb, which Harold Bloom, in his introduction to his modern critical views. This is from Chelsea House. I've got tons of these, but Harold Bloom really focuses on that episode of Byron the Light Bulb. It seems that of all of Gravity's Rainbow, that's the only one that really hit him. And I think it's because that it's so well done as imaginative literature. It is a treat to read and can be read on its own, though of course in the context of a linear reading of the novel, it gets its fuller thrust and context. But it brings up a great point and a really a pillar of Gravity's Rainbow, and that is the thought of, if we manage to get outside the system, outside of their system, do we cease to exist? Maybe we need a system so that we feel alive and feel that we have a part to play. This is a core question to take to the novel. In the introduction, like I said, to his modern critical views, Pynchon, he says that, Bloom says that Pynchon has found ways of representing the impulse to defy the system, even though both impulse and its representations are always defeated. Pynchon surpasses every American writer since Faulkner at invention, which Dr. Samuel Johnson, the greatest of Western literary critics, rightly considered to be the essence of poetry or fiction. So Bloom was wrong about David Foster Wallace, but he is right about Thomas Pynchon. Nothing holds or could hold Gravity's Rainbow together except Slothrop. When he is finally scattered, the book stops and the apocalyptic rocket blasts off. This collection is important because it does contain Richard Poirier, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly, I've never heard it said, but Richard Poirier, The Importance of Thomas Pynchon, which came out in 1976, so 3 years after Gravity's Rainbow. And this is a very important essay that many different critics point back to. He says, Pynchon is also, after Hawthorne, the American writer with the deepest kind of skepticism about the advantages of being included by the culture America has inherited and shaped. Amateur readers may be unable to respond to the relentless vitality of Pynchon's writing, but professional academic readers can positively smother it. This is great. He offers up a warning to scholars and to academia about jumping onto this novel and making it into something that will be this monolith that is impenetrable, and thus basically smothering it and not allowing it to reach the audience it wants to reach. He says, we're in a situation where neither the amateur nor the professional reader seems capable of reading Pynchon for the fun of it, for the relish of local pleasures, for the savoring of how sentences sound as they turn into one another, carrying with them and creating as they go, endlessly reverberating echoes from the vast ranges of contemporary life and culture. Wonderfully stated, a wonderfully, wonderfully put statement about Pynchon's prose in Gravity's Rainbow. Pynchon really has, so far as I can see, no wholly safe constituency except one, the Academy. And unless academic writers and teachers are extremely careful, they will do to him the damage already done to Joyce and Eliot. Put simply, the damage consists of looking at the writing as something to be figured out by a process of translation, a process which omits the weirdness and pleasure of the reading experience as it goes along. All of us have together gone unknowingly beyond it, passed unknowingly into a world where the effects of exposure to the implementations of science and technology are so pervasive as to have been invisible and inaudible. He's talking about where we find ourselves in 1976, so it's even more resonant, even more relevant now. We have few ways, for example, of measuring the effect of the media within which we live, except by the instrumentalities of the media. This is extremely perceptive. And then finally, he closes it by saying, Pynchon is the epitome of an American writer out of the great classics of the 19th century, Hawthorne, Emerson, and Melville especially. You guys probably saw my video on the Cruft of fiction mega novels and the science of paying attention by David Letzler, and he saves Gravity's Rainbow for last. And he talks about how Gravity's Rainbow is the greatest of all maximalist novels. Like I said, again, it's hard to tell whether he hates maximalist novels or loves them, but he makes it most explicitly clear for Gravity's Rainbow that he loves it. He says, Gravity's Rainbow has that rare property shared by only the greatest books. It turns us all into hypocrites. It does so by vacillating so rapidly between profound allegory and absurd conspiracy theory that it reveals how frighteningly inadequate are our cognitive apparatuses for distinguishing the two. And that's very well put. We'll see more about that as we go through more literature here in the literature review. But it does, as you're reading Gravity's Rainbow and your mind is making all of these conjectures and it's triangulating different things, trying to, put things into place, it will constantly, you'll constantly run into contradiction, or something you thought was exactly what the book was saying is now reversed. And there are other critics and scholars whom we'll see offer a way of looking at the book that is not either or. And that's our natural mode, is to look either something is A or it's B, and it's and, or both and, as two different critics put it. Letzler says, after all, the quintuple zeros real-world rocket analogs are post-war America's two most sublime creations, the space shuttle and the ICBM. A good rocket to take us to the stars, and an evil rocket for the world's suicide, bearing within them many of our post-war era's greatest hopes and fears about who we are and how we relate to the universe. And that's a good way to also answer people who say, what is this book about? It's about our post-war neuroses and hopes. Brian Stonehill, The Self-Conscious Novel, Artifice and Fiction from Joyce to Pynchon. He has this to say: the entire novel seeks to produce the specific aesthetic effect which I shall call the power of paradox, which is the peculiar suspension of the intellectual and emotional faculties between two equally plausible but mutually exclusive modes of perception or belief. Gravity's Rainbow creates its own paradoxical effect by offering the reader two antithetical perspectives on everything that happens in its pages. Everything in it can be seen as related causally or related casually. The novel provides evidence for both conclusions. If events in Gravity's Rainbow are related causally, then a massive conspiracy envelops Tyrone Slothrop and the other characters. This is confirmed by the novel. If events are related casually, however, then the apparent links are no more than the characters and readers' paranoid imaginings. This, too, is confirmed by the novel. To every question, the action of Gravity's Rainbow offers two plausible answers, each a contradiction of the other. And, this is sort of like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which comes into Gravity's Rainbow explicitly. The more we measure one thing, the less precise we can be with another measurement. The Art of Excess by Tom LeClaire. I also went through this one in my Gaddis videos, but here we are for Pynchon. Gravity's Rainbow, just like with Letzler, is the exemplary text for LeClaire. It represents Earth, and our relation to Gravity's Rainbow is thus our relationship to the Earth, which is really interesting. He sort of makes an analogy between the novel Gravity's Rainbow and the whole Earth, which is pretty apt. And Pynchon uses the Art of Excess to first alienate the reader and then reintegrate the reader. This is a great discussion of that very act, of that very sensation of being sort of jammed up and then reintegrated into culture. Pynchon can be called the master of the art of excess. The qualities of Gravity's Rainbow that often discourage readers are necessary functions of Pynchon's profound understanding of and concern for the earth and human survival. So these are big themes. These are mighty themes. Converging on Nazi Germany, the novel suggests that fascism is a consequence of and symbol for the whole of Europe, and perhaps most of human history's attempt to colonize the earth, to transform it into a homeland for a master species. This recognition of radically new and massive information in the world and the impulse to represent this information are, I believe, the ultimate motives for the art of excess in Gravity's Rainbow. And this is only more relevant today in our mass information age, in our big data age. Gravity's Rainbow is the exemplar of excess, the art that takes multiple risks to have, finally, integrated and powerful impact. Mastery. David Seed, the fictional labyrinths of Thomas Pynchon. He says, Roger and Jessica, that is Roger Mexico, the statistician, and his wartime paramour, Jessica Swanlake, are not simply interrupted by the rocket blast. They are transformed into two-dimensional shapes. Their very reality changes. And then skips down. It is a weakness of V, meaning Pynchon's first novel, V, that with the possible exceptions of Mondragon and Fausto, nothing seems to be at stake, whereas in Gravity's Rainbow, Pynchon's intermittent use of the realistic mode admits a far greater range of feeling and desire in his characters. And that's really saying something, because one thing that Pynchon has been criticized about a lot, especially in Gravity's Rainbow, is the flatness of his characters, the paper-thin quality, or basically his characters are concepts. But here, David Seed makes an argument for feeling and desire in the characters. Gravity's Rainbow constantly stresses the passivity which wartime officialdom induces and locates sources of power in organizations rather than individuals. Hence, the startling reduction in Gravity's Rainbow of Hitler's importance. In chapter 40, Pynchon refers to Jung's notion of the collective unconscious, where Jung demonstrates the relevance of mythic patterns to dream symbolism. Pynchon applies the concept to the collective unconscious, to a pathological interpretation of the rise of Nazism. So this is getting at, from a Karl Jungian perspective, exactly what I was trying to explain when people first asked me what this novel is about. It's about exactly this, trying to get a concept of the collective unconscious to a pathological interpretation of the rise of Nazism. The latter emerges, meaning Nazism, as a collective yearning for the primitive and irrational, which leads ultimately to death. To avoid the reader categorizing Blisserow, that is Captain Blisserow, that's his code name during the rocket project at Peenemünde and in Northhausen, that's Captain Weissmann, which is white man, and Blisserow derives from bleaching, making white. This is the sort of incarnation of evil in Gravity's Rainbow. To avoid the reader categorizing Blisserow too easily, Pynchon depicts him relativistically. To Kate, or maybe Katya, he is a dark oven, enigmatic but necessary. To the technician Pokler, that is Franz Pokler, who was used, he's a very passive character, obsessed with rocketry, who was used by Blisserow / Weissmann to manipulate the mysterious rocket that haunts the whole novel, which is the quintuple zero, that is 5 zeros, and he retrofitted it in the nose of it, gave it this fairing made out of none other than the novel plastic Imipex G. More on that in a bit. To the technician Pokler, he is an aging bureaucrat running part of the V2 program. To Gottfried, he is lover and master. In spite of his apparent power, Blisserow is no less driven than the other characters and has an unimpressive physical appearance, being short and myopic, like Himmler. William Pynchon's The Meritorious Price of Our Redemption, 1650, this is the ancestor of Thomas Pynchon, attempted to soften the doctrine of predestination and to emphasize Christ's humanity, as a result of which the Massachusetts General Court ordered it to be publicly burnt. Ultimately driven out of the colony, William Slothrop / Pynchon, in effect, joined the Preterite himself, that is, the people who are passed over in Calvinist doctrine. The Herreros had caught Pynchon's attention when he was researching for V, and for his third novel, he followed through his interest with even more reading about the Herreros. And there's an appendix in the back of this book with a letter that Pynchon wrote talking about some of his sources. Because he saw analogies between the German treatment of the Herreros and of the Jews, the American treatment of Indians, and of the Vietnamese. Here he's talking about a character in Gravity's Rainbow. This is a fictional character. Gerhard von Gohl, a Nazi filmmaker and black marketeer, says that believing that his propaganda film about the Schwarzkommando has made them real, the Herero people. He in the novel, really, von Gohl believes that his film about these people brought them into existence. He agrees to make a film of the 19th century Argentine epic Martin Fierro, which is about a gaucho. And there are these Argentine anarchists. And von Gohl starts to stage and put together a set with these Argentines and to make a movie. And this is a huge comment on how popular culture can condition the mindset. Here being the power of film, and especially at that time when film was such a novel concept, a novel entertainment. And in fact, Gravity's Rainbow is very much modeled after the concept of a film. David Cowart, who also wrote, most notably in terms of Pynchon and Gravity's Rainbow, the dark passages of history that we'll get to. This is the art of allusion. Though one does not read Pynchon or any other author to learn about bleak cosmic truths like entropy, one may go to literature, to Greek tragedy, to Shakespeare, to Hardy, for an aesthetic or human response to them. This is important, and I marked it as a highlight because I have often heard, why in the world should I just read this book that's all about these scientific concepts when I can just go and kind of learn about them? And the fact is that readers, we go to fiction for an aesthetic human response to such things as the science of entropy and indeterminacy and the V2 rocket. He devoted more of his education, this is talking about Pynchon, he devoted more of his education to literature than to science because he did not major in engineering in college, as more than one biographical sketch maintains. Pynchon spent only 1 year in engineering physics, after which he transferred to the College of Arts and Sciences. Pynchon's writing, then, embraces both science and the arts. He has, in Usman's phrase, shouldered the sky, set himself the task of responding to everything in the experience of modern man. And I think that right there captures why I love Gravity's Rainbow so much, because it embraces both the science and the arts. Pynchon is almost universally perceived as a writer of the first magnitude, a genius who richly deserves the many comparisons with Joyce, Melville, Rabelais, and Cervantes. This study will also, by concentrating on Pynchon's interest in the arts, provide a needed counterweight to the numerous studies of Pynchon's use of science. Gravity's Rainbow is a book at once structured as a movie and filled with movie allusions. And you can see this all the way through, including the little empty squares that subdivide episodes. They look like the edges of film strips. Not to mention that the book ends with a bunch of people who are supposed to represent us in a theater. In Gravity's Rainbow, Pynchon uses film as a critique of life, insisting that the one is not more or less real than the other. Gravity's Rainbow, in fact, purports to be a movie itself. War is an enterprise that often shares a vocabulary with the movies. Action, for example, is a word common to both sound stages and battlefields. Both wargamers and filmmakers operate from a scenario. Often one reads of directors who are martinets or generals, or of movies that bomb. Stars and combat riflemen have supporting casts and troops, respectively, and shooting may be done with a camera as well as with a gun. A theater, finally, may be either a place to watch movies or a geographical subdivision of a war. And we'll see, especially when we get to the analysis of the first episode, theater the two different concepts of theater as cinema and battlefield are very much utilized in Gravity's Rainbow. We should note how systematically Pynchon inverts the ancient and insidiously racist symbology that equates whiteness with virtue and blackness with evil. As blackness tends to be vital in Gravity's Rainbow, Enzian and his fellow Schwarzkommando are presented positively, even though a faction, the Empty Ones, advocates racial suicide. As whiteness, on the other hand, tends to be deadly, the novel's most viciously sadistic character, the man who conceives and directs the Quintuple Zero rocket project, bears the name Weissmann, or again, white man. His nom de guerre, Blissero, also signifies a deadly whiteness, for Blicker was the nickname the early Germans gave to death. When Pynchon says that Slothrop is being broken down and scattered, this is towards the end of the book, when also the style of the episodes become broken down and fragmented and scattered. The ritual dismemberment of vegetation gods whose parts were scattered like seeds. There's a connection there, as in the sacrifice of an Osiris, or more to the point, Orpheus, guaranteed the spring. Slothrop's scattering seems to fructify the counterforce which attempts his rescue as its first mission. Very well put. At the end of the book, Pynchon introduces Max and Moritz, Blissero's assistants in firing the Quintuple Zero rocket. The names derive from Wilhelm Busch's cartoon characters, and they are those of the first two successfully launched A2 rockets. So this is just another place. There was also a stamp of a woman in the moon that was from the Fritz Lang movie, Woman in the Moon. They put that sticker, historically true fact, they put that on a rocket. Here again, Pynchon is using the names of these characters, but they're actually the names given to the first two successfully launched A2 rockets. And again, with film, which is what David Cowart focuses on so well, we're talking about, it says Pöckler's daughter, which her name is Ilsa. That Pöckler's daughter can, like his dreams, be indistinguishable from film is merely another example of the undermining of the distinction between film and reality that Pynchon has continually engaged in. If this cinematic eschatology works, it does so because of the success with which Pynchon has undermined any positivist, common sense bias the reader may have brought to the novel. He accomplishes that end by means of an extensive program of distortion, one aspect of which is the casting of doubt on the distinctions between life and film that we have been examining. And yeah, I would recommend this, The Art of Allusion from David Cowart. The Grim Phoenix, Reconstructing Thomas Pynchon by William Plater. Plater's main pillars for his whole study are the idea of the closed system and entropy as social phenomena, the way in which illusion and reality are aspects of form, the interrelations of life and death, and the way in which order and connectedness are fictions of necessity as well as convenience. Some preliminary pointers. Forces and processes are more important than people. Organizations and structures are more the manifestation of hope than of conviction. The ability and opportunity to communicate are measures only of how little there is to be said. Edward Pointsman, the behavioralist, the Pavlovian, Blissero, and Tyrone Slothrop are characters who begin to suggest the limits of the world and the isolation of the self. To the extent that Gravity's Rainbow is about anything, it is about the interaction of the forces of nature with the efforts of men to create their artificial orders and to impose them on nature. And yeah, that's highly accurate. I mean, just the rocket alone is a human construction. And furthermore, it's an artifice and represents the efforts of men to escape natural laws such as gravity. In Blissero's region, there is no distinction between illusion and reality, past and present. He has made time his own in an effort to transcend his own death, the end of personal time, and the entropy of the universe. His instrument, with the help of Mondagen and others, is the rocket. And in fact, we will see that, as is with the entire novel, there's no real death in it. There aren't any killings. There isn't violence. There are things that revile, but we don't see Blicero die. And in fact, the narrator will tell us that if we want to find him, he is still alive, and we need to look into the offices of bureaucracies and so on. So presumably he is one of these Nazis who escaped maybe to South America. But that is to say that in the book, it does indeed present Blicero as someone who makes his own time and tries to escape death. For Blicero, the shape of his special rocket, the quintuple zero, is the vehicle for his complete and ultimate control of the eternal time that coincides with Brennschluss. And this right here, I'm going to go ahead and throw in that, he creating this rocket to get ultimate control over time, and that it coincides with Brennschluss, which is the cutting off of burning fuel. It's empty with fuel, and this is when the arc starts to descend from the parabolic shape of the rocket's trajectory. But the fact that that's what this rocket symbolizes for him. For me, this is why I believe it is the same rocket that is fired in 1945 and reappears in the 1970s, which really makes the very opening episode of Gravity's Rainbow, Pirate's Dream, a lot more interesting and really toyed with me in a satisfying way this time around. And I'll get more to that in the first episode analysis. Pynchon's basic views were formulated in V and did not change, but only grew more complex. And in fact, V was the first novel. No, it wasn't. I read Entropy, his short story, was the very first of Pynchon's work that I read. And then I read The Crying of Lot 49, and then V, and then Gravity's Rainbow. Everyone seeks information about something. I mean, all characters in the novel are seeking information. Information, just like right now for us, information is a valuable commodity. Within the closed system of the world, lives are being sorted instead of molecules. And this is an allusion to, or a reference to, Maxwell's sorting demon. As Slothrop fades from the world, he becomes signal zero, perhaps through a process of converting information to entropy. I think this perfectly captures the experience of reading Gravity's Rainbow and gives, again, reason for rereading it. Plater says, even his stories and novels seem to draw energy from readers as they struggle with a signal-to-noise ratio. This is getting at tenets of cybernetics. As they study the verbal landscape as a map. If there is a return for energy lost, it most probably comes as information gained, perhaps as knowledge about a closed system as seen from outside it. So this is talking about Fritz Lang's 1929 movie, Die Frau im Mond. Okay, I said it incorrectly earlier. This is talking about the role that it played on the imagination at the time. It says, although science fiction, it captured the imagination of a generation of young engineers, including Wernher von Braun, and was instrumental in the formulation of rocket clubs like the Society for Space Navigation throughout Germany in the pre-war years. After the British bombed the militarily unimportant city of Lübeck, the Germans ordered destroyed every site in England that Baedeker, meaning let me finish reading it, that Baedeker had marked with an asterisk. And this is where, fact meets fiction in Pynchon again, because Pynchon, in trying to get every single little detail correct, he read through the popular travel writing of Baedeker and to get all the geographical matter correct in his novels. Baedeker was so reliable and such an authoritative source that the Germans used Baedeker, his books about London, to target important sites. And reading those works from Baedeker, those nonfiction works from Baedeker, and seeing those asterisks in different places could very well have given Pynchon the idea of the maps that we see early on of both the V2 bombings in Blitzkrieg London and the conquests of Tyrone Slothrop. Nothing in all of Pynchon's fiction rivals his accomplishment in showing how technology and its secular allies have reshaped the world. Powerful statement. In Gravity's Rainbow, film becomes a self-sufficient landscape of its own, and the novel even functions as a movie with frozen time frames, a cast of Hollywood extras, images of reality, and a continuity of form rather than experience. Van Gogh, the Nazi filmmaker, can believe that his fake film of a black German military group produced the Allied propaganda machine actually is incarnated in the Schwarzkommando, as we saw earlier. And by the end of the novel, he has produced a movie that goes on indefinitely, 24 hours a day, and is designed to take back the seeds of reality. So now we could see the ending is not a scattering and breaking up, but maybe a slowing down and then a reversal. Because Van Gogh is seeing that if his film in a linear forward fashion can put something into existence, what happens if it's played backwards? One of the major questions of the novel is Slothrop real? Both Slothrop and the reader learn that he is a film character. Now, I love this because there's this scene where Slothrop visits with a Mrs. Quode, and they eat these wartime candies, which sound horrible. They're these wine jellies. But Plater has pointed out that this is historically real. And he says that, these candies are real. And he says that while the piece of candy itself comments on the discrepancy between appearance and reality, the incident is characteristic of the nervous humor that helped Londoners survive their anxiety. Anyone who sampled one of those candies can still recall the taste 30 years later. Slothrop's exaggerated agony is a shared experience. And that's something that I knew nothing about. But of course, if someone had had those candies in real life and read this book, this is just one of these representations in literature that constantly blur the line between fact and fiction and invite us in at a deeper level. When Slothrop ceases to search for the rocket, communication is no longer a mechanism for control. Thomas Schaub's Pynchon, the voice of ambiguity. I like these personal anecdotes in some of the preferences, such as this one. I first read the book in 1974, and for me, it still remains one of the persistent encounters of my intellectual life. And many people have found that true. The uncertainties and ambiguities which attend the reading of Pynchon's fiction are not a failure of the reader, nor a result of authorial neglect or confusion. And he tries to show that this scrupulousness with all these details and is ultimately deliberate ambiguity. The experience of ambiguity in the reading of Pynchon is essential, in fact. It is a necessary result of his design to bring readers to the uncertainties of the precarious balance where possibilities abound. So it isn't just this mimesis where we're saying Pynchon presents these things because this is what it's like to live these days. It's just bewildering and we can't really make sense of anything. And, postmodernism has shown us that, we're ontologically and epistemologically broken. But it's not just stopping there and saying, Pynchon, why do all this work really? If we just think about it, why would an author just do all that work simply to just show what it's like? But I think Schaub really gets at something by saying that it brings readers to a precarious balance where possibilities abound. Pynchon's use of entropy as a metaphor of decline underlies all of his fiction, which even people who haven't read Pynchon generally know this by now. But Schaub goes on to say, he is more concerned, however, with the ways in which his characters respond to the threat of decline than with the fact of decline itself. So again, as another academic said, we come to these novels to see human responses, a human aesthetic. These poles are free will and determinism. These poles are personified within Gravity's Rainbow by Edward Pointsman, champion of cause and effect history, and Roger Mexico, the modest statistician for whom historical events are not linked but may be plotted spatially by their distribution, like the Poisson pattern. Pynchon's writing is the representation of the human experience of perceiving the world in parts while suspecting and hoping it is whole. So that's also sort of a riff on St. Paul. I see now in part, as if through a glass darkly. Film and our relation to it are for Pynchon an allegory of free will and determinism. To read Gravity's Rainbow with any kind of comfort, we must recognize the book as making available to us continuities beyond the primacy of the conscious self and its memories. The rocket, the V2 rocket, so conceived, is a transformation of a man-made weapon into an instrument of divine will, as the book hurtles towards its last delta T. Therefore, Pynchon places Gottfried's ascension in numerous mythic, religious, and popular forms. Again, it's like every moment, we look at it as a film reel. It's every single scene, every frame in there is infused with multiple layers of meaning. In the vernacular of Gravity's Rainbow, all lives are a succession of singular points, where the curves of history form the terrible intersection from which we must choose a direction. Most of the characters in Gravity's Rainbow withdraw in fright. Paranoid order becomes in Gravity's Rainbow the modern equivalent of the Puritans' providence. This is implied in the narrator's diction, which is drawn from the definition of sacrament in the Book of Common Prayer, an outward and visible sign of inward and spiritual grace. The danger of our freedom lies not in the certainty of falling, but in the vertical solutions we erect against that knowledge, such as the V2 rocket. The aptness of the Poisson distribution for Pynchon's intentions is remarkable, for the equation literally joins randomness with regularity, and I said as much earlier, but I think I stated it: free will and determinism. The paradox of Pynchon's career thus far is that a writer so vehemently communal should be so resolutely private. But this is only a seeming paradox, for publicity is not community, and exchanges being known well for being well known. It is in his isolation that Pynchon remains one of us. His perfect absence from the public view contributes to the scattered presence of his Orphic voice. His absence gives his books a curious autonomy they would not otherwise possess and assist them in blurring the readerly distinction between fiction and the real world. His disembodied voice gives vitality and importance to the neglected and private details of the life beyond his fiction. His writing, therefore, keeps us company and awakens in us the possibility that we are not alone. The awakening is the physical grace of Thomas Pynchon, at once communal and incomplete, a continuity of song that never resolves. Listen. David Cowart, Thomas Pynchon, and the Dark Passages of History. I highly recommend this book. He says that, as anyone who has grappled with any of Pynchon knows, there is an extraordinary grasp of the workings of history. The same could be said of Joyce. The author hints that questing has a value irrespective of the authenticity of that for which one quests. The quest itself lends purpose to life, enabling the hapless individual to function, to see the cradle-to-grave journey as worthwhile. And, most people know the word of wisdom, the quip, the adage that says, enjoy the journey. Don't focus on the destination, enjoy the journey, because that's the greater part of the quest. And Thomas Pynchon in Gravity's Rainbow sort of takes that to maximal heights, although the ending of the book is worth the journey as well. He presents a question: will the rocket enable humanity to go to the stars or to destroy itself? And, a lot of human invention, we can look at it that way. The vehicle, does it allow us to get from one place to another faster or to kill ourselves? Airplanes, same thing. Skyscrapers, same thing. He suggests in his work that the romance of the West with technology, especially in the 20th century, owes much to the German example. It was German chemistry that inaugurated the technology of plastics, so emblematic of the breathtaking possibilities and dangers of tinkering with nature. He intimates that racism in particular derives as much from unconscious fears as from social conditioning. He has been criticized, Pynchon has been criticized for obscuring the actual horror of the death camps. He prefers to represent Nazi genocide obliquely. But from V to Gravity's Rainbow, the author seems to move towards a stronger realization that Germany does not have a monopoly on racism and genocide. That's a strong point. He says the novel opens with an imagined V2 hit on that Victorian emblem of technology and its promise, the Crystal Palace. And when we get to the first episode, we'll catch that allusion to the Crystal Palace. But what's interesting here is that Frederick R. Karl, in his book, believes that opening rocket is the German buzz bomb, when in fact it is a V2. So just to show that even scholars can conflict with one another in a book this complex. This is a great book, Dwight Eden's The Gnostic Pynchon. I highly recommend this. Gnosis is a man-made or a man-developed knowledge or mastery over the cosmos. There's a new axiology that needs to be defined as the lines between modernism and postmodernism have blurred. Edens, he handles the modern and the postmodern in Pynchon's work, whereas Moore, for example, defines a positivism of connectedness. That means Thomas More in his Connectedness book, which we'll get to. And Catherine Hume, who we've already read from, defines a system of contradicting mythologies. But Edens, he defines a grid of religious responses to epistemological and ontological crisis. So the enveloping drama for Pynchon, in Eden's view, is ultimately a religious one. And Edens terms Pynchon's religion in Gravity's Rainbow as Orphic naturalism. And he sets it against nihilism. The effect of both forms of Pynchon criticism, I shall argue, is to reveal a persistent modernist nostalgia for vanished axiological foundations. Axiological is a study of value systems or valuation in the midst of vividly experienced anomie. Anomie is a lack of social standards in a group of people. Thomas More opts unabashedly for a comprehensive connectedness based on C.G. Jung's principle of synchronicity. What Catherine Hume, finally ends up with is a carefully calibrated equilibrium in which structuralist and post-structuralist readings of Gravity's Rainbow complement each other in a sort of symbiotic binarity. I love this. Gravity's Rainbow and Joyce's Ulysses are those rival encyclopedias that are frequently said to be incommensurable and just as frequently used to measure each other. Recent developments in value theory, that is axiology, especially have tended to blur certain distinctions between modernism and postmodernism, with results that bear directly upon where we locate Pynchon's own axiology in the spectrum between a value-free nihilism and a value-positive traditionalism. Pynchon is comically postmodernist in the sense that the parody, kitsch, and burnout of contemporary life are embedded in his work, but tragically modernist in the pervasive, poignant sense of massive axiological catastrophe that provides the normative context for this lived caricature of life. This is a great explanation and great approach for Gravity's Rainbow. Edens defines a comprehensive grid of religious responses to epistemological and ontological crisis, and the grid itself is organized around the concept of Gnosticism. Pynchon veers back and forth between the hypotheses of absolute connectedness and absolute non-connectedness, thus setting up various dialectics of order and chaos. I love this line. There's good humor in Eden's book. Pynchon was, if we may trust the scholarly integrity of Playboy, raised as a Catholic and still attending Mass while at Cornell. There are parameters that generate the complex religious dialectic of Pynchon's fiction. A fluctuating tension between nostalgia for cosmic harmony and commitment to amoral power worship, superimposed upon the fluctuating tension between the notion of a neutral, structureless universe and that of a universe infiltrated by insidious structures of control. Pynchon himself quite consciously links the cabals of early Judeo-Christian Gnosticism to the scientistic cabals of his own century. He takes a very well-cited, well-referenced line from early in the first episode where it says this is not a disentanglement from, but a progressive knotting into. And he says that this is perfect for the now familiar paradox, an attempt of the preterite to escape from Gnostic menace. The religious response evoked by a full realization of this phenomenon is a variety of orphism that leans heavily upon the assumptions of Rilke's poetry in its identification with natural process and its assimilation of life and death into a unifying lyric of praise. And Rilke is infused all throughout Gravity's Rainbow. The Duino elegies and the sonnets to Orpheus are used, especially selections will be literally quoted. And to understand Blicero's character a little more, we are told that his favorite is the 10th elegy. The assertion that these meshes are comprehensible only to God is not a perfunctory gesture of piety, but is Pynchon's investiture of earth with transcendental mystery. Some passages, there's one explicitly stated here, seem at first glance to be a slight arabesque in praise of nature, but actually contain the essence of Pynchon's religious reverence. Slothrop's Orphic harp is, of course, his harmonica of earlier Boston days, rediscovered in a German river. And this is such a great moment of the book when it happens. This harmonica that was lost down a toilet in Boston and then resurfaces in a stream in the Harz of Germany, and really connects and illuminates Slothrop as Orpheus, right on the cusp of being torn to pieces. It's just a beautiful, beautiful moment where you see that Pynchon is not just a brainiac and a genius, but he is a good storyteller and a good writer. Partaking of these powers after recovering his harp, which is really the harmonica, and spending hours of naked openness to nature, Slothrop experiences a moment of Orphic transformation that involves absolute unity with Earth. This bumbling, good-natured figure, like Leopold Bloom or Slothrop, happens to fit the larger pattern, humanity's archetypal wandering and return, and it is this mythic pattern that redeems the figure even as it contributes, ironically, to the mock-epic perspective in which we view him. There is a conflict between word and earth, that's capital W, capital E, word and earth, pervades almost the whole of Gravity's Rainbow. Just as the attempt to measure certain subatomic phenomena would in itself alter the measurements sought, because of human observation, we see how it affects quantum mechanics. So the attempt to textualize the moment of mystical illumination alters the quintessence of that moment. This is what the Akin undertakes by communicating in Orphic song rather than holy writ. And we can see here Schopenhauer's and Nietzsche's conception that music is pre-conscious. Pain for Blicero is not the primal pain of disappointments and deaths, one's own and those of loved ones, built into the scheme of nature through preterition, but a perversely engineered and artificial pain associated in the short run with sadomasochistic indulgences and in the long run with the culmination of Gnostic death worship. Rilke condemns the Liedstadt, or the song state, as a retreat where escapists subvert Earth's edifying negatives, but Blicero turns it into a retreat where decadents subvert Earth's edifying positives. The latter had found the model for his own city 20 years before in Southwest Africa. It remained only to transfer the sadistic rituals of Foppel's villa, as described in V, Pynchon's first book, to a V2 launching site in Holland, and to enthrall Gottfried and Katja as fairy tale children waiting with him for the oven, or the Kinderofen. The text of Gravity's Rainbow is encyclopedic, religious, focused on the ultimate issues of ethics and metaphysics, and the novel functions as a Torah of Orphic naturalism, revealing the nature of Gnostic evil at the same time that it reveals the way back to communication with Earth. Nostalgia is one of the dominant emotions of Gravity's Rainbow, and it is obviously connected with the impulse of return. Stefan Matisic, The Lines of Flight, Discursive Time and Countercultural Desire in the works of Thomas Pynchon. I would recommend this only for people who love literary theory. In fact, it's indebted to an earlier book by Hanyo Barasum called Pynchon's Poetics, Interfacing Theory and Text. They are both immersed in French theory predominantly, Baudrillard, Lacan, and Derrida. The earlier book is actually a little more accessible than this later one. There is fruit here, but it is exemplary of why academic texts can be so difficult. However, it does offer a close reading of the episode of an episode with Lenny and Ilse Pöckler that is really an incredible close reading. And just like the earlier book, Pynchon's Poetics, it sets up its theoretical framework, borrowing from Lacan, and in this case, also from Heidegger and others. It sets up that framework first, then applies it. But it can be difficult to follow. Gravity's Rainbow sets out to ramify the symbolic dimension of the counterculture, the dreamlike empty form legible in the Times' Mindless Pleasures, which was the original title for Gravity's Rainbow. Its exacerbations of discourse, its overt travesties of sense and meaning. Pynchon's emphasis on the physics of the rocket's flight underscores a preoccupation with escape that sutures his work to the countercultural withdrawal from dominant society. At the same time, it focuses a displacement in that withdrawal that makes it more than an imaginary escapism. The novel is an attempt to widen the parameters of historical emplotment that make Pynchon's corpus a meditation on post-war society and its own countercultural desire. The novel draws together an encyclopedic array of referential detail, from the history of science, engineering, business, political history, modernist, and popular culture, to tell the story of the emergent system of late capitalism. Pynchon also raises the stakes of a complicity in the very real historical violence that underpins this disconnection by thematizing in Franz's obsession with the rocket a susceptibility to exploitation and an erotic identification with power. Like Anti-Oedipus, which was the book with Guattari and Deleuze, Gravity's Rainbow is a virtual book. It is organized around the fourth dimensional vector of a desire to narrate the deeply implicate orders of discourse in late capitalism. Gravity signifies for Pynchon not simply a constraint, the weighing down of an oppression, or the strange vertigo of a desire for unconsciousness, but rather the ground of a powerful facility for movement, for poise of thought and feeling, for what Pynchon might call synthesis and control. The intense fashioning of sentences in which a kind of gravity confers on them a resonance with profoundly physical energies, a density that gives them the mass and texture almost of things. What a great description of Pynchon's sentences. Gravity's Rainbow dramatizes the fiction of origin. This turn to fable and language is for Pynchon expressly political, for it charges writing with the anarchy of production, the fundamental violence of beginning, the negativity of change itself. The novel, fictionalizing the fiction of origin, redoubles that charge to grasp the death drive at work in its own textual body. Gravity's Rainbow highlights this discontinuity most explicitly through its narrative displacement from America in the late 1960s and early 70s to Europe in 1945. This displacement is also reversed as Pynchon freights the text with more and more explicit reference to the present moment of its writing, intertextually sabotaging the unities of time, place, and action. This is why I like to turn to secondary criticism and to theorists and academics and critics, because they can sum up something that you feel about a work but can't express or articulate very well. They can do it sometimes to a degree that is so satisfying, so rich. Gravity's Rainbow will forever remain in this peculiar suspension between life and death, in a present buried in the past and stretched toward the future, ironically aware of itself as caught in a breakdown signaled by repetition without sense. As a meditation upon writing, Gravity's Rainbow strains its own functions till they turn back on themselves, become self-parody or meta-parody in patterns of cellular or algorithmic replication. What can be vertiginous is Pynchon's technique of wacky association, the admixture of historical fact and blatant fantasy, the playful inventiveness of the names he gives to his characters, the ligature connecting the angel over Lubeck to the V2 rocket, discourses of the occult and Christian symbolism, all combine to form an impression of intricate pastiche, a sort of verbal folly that, at the level of language, exemplifies the subversion of meaning that the novel also narrativizes. There is in Gravity's Rainbow an alternation between content and expression, theme and structure, at times so rapid they appear indistinguishable from one another, such as film, where it's happening so quickly it seems like one continuous movement, but it's really individual still frames, which is a very important element of Gravity's Rainbow. They can seem indistinguishable from one another simultaneously, and it is the effect of simultaneity that conditions the strange tonality proper to Pynchon's style. It accounts for the levity or theatricality that everywhere marks his prose, or mars his prose if you're a critic, the reflexivity or doubleness that effectively blocks any serious interpretation. Pynchon is interested, or obsessed, with the structure of addiction, and builds his novel according to principles of doubling, replication, recurrence, pattern, and plot to reflect a historical moment for which addiction has become a general condition. Pynchon presents one of the novel's numerous Ouroboros figures, which is the snake that's eating its own tail. The Ouroboros, a circuit that links the end with the beginning, a circle that becomes a single point, a catastrophic collapse of meaning into tautology and repetition. The line of flight Pynchon draws between autism on the one hand and radical fantasy or desiring production on the other forms an inclusive boundary in the text, and its oscillation between coming back and drifting off engenders its schizophrenic form. So again, going back to the anti-Oedipus as a pillar of Matisich's framework here, he says that this is actually the form of Gravity's Rainbow is schizophrenic. This oscillation comes to a kind of focused, as already intimated in Slothrop. I mean, he's talking about an actual, a specific episode there, but Weisenburger also talks about how Pynchon, some of the slipperiness we run into with reading him is that he uses different focal points for the narrative. Slothrop's final disappearance. Perhaps it is a negative and differential diachrony that gives Slothrop's final disappearance its fullest meaning, particularly in light of the day it takes place, which is August 6, 1945, when an American plane dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And this is just like Hitler and like the concentration camps. This is given to us by Pynchon obliquely, but somehow is strangely all the more powerful for showing just in part and not in whole. Like I said, that book was sort of a successor to this one, Pynchon's Poetics. Again, if you love especially French theory, you will love this book. He examines the modes of personal and cultural conditioning portrayed in Gravity's Rainbow. That investigation is supplemented by a reading of the Kyrgyz Light episode, a passage that concentrates on the poetological implications of a completely conditioned, textualized, and simulated world in which various of Pynchon's key metaphors converge. The further sections on Gravity's Rainbow treat Slothrop's quest and the poetological effects of the filmic strategies employed in the book. So very much in debt to Baudrillard's simulacrum and simulation, and using that to show that Gravity's Rainbow is essentially a simulacra of an entire world from Pynchon. In Pynchon's texts, the grammar of language is continually overlaid with its lexicon. The first thing that a reader is confronted with is therefore a world not of relations, but of the sheer physicality of objects and the words that describe them. What makes Lacan's theory especially relevant to literary studies, and in particular to my study of Pynchon, is that it combines the fields of psychoanalysis and modern linguistics, and thus those of subjectivity and writing, in one theoretical project. And that is as good a reason as any for a dedicated and serious reader to study Lacan. Although language is the only means to communicate, real communication is impossible because the textual machine does not allow for a direct and complete transfer of an ideal and stable meaning. Therefore, in the transference of meaning, whether reading, going from the mind of the author to the mind of the reader, fidelity is lost. Lacan, like Pynchon, sees human reality and knowledge as inevitably paranoid. Why? Well, because this paranoid nature of reality results from the specific formation of the ego during what Lacan calls the mirror stage, which defines on a visual pre-linguistic level, or the imaginary, the phantasmatic and libidinal character of the human perception of both self and others. And after the subject's entry into language, the symbolic, this imaginary realm continues to pervade the symbolic one, through which, however, all further imaginary encounters are filtered. This inextricable entanglement of sex, or jouissance, and death, that is, eros and thanatos, becomes obvious in the designation of the orgasm as the French call it, petit mort, or little death. The relation between language, silence, and death is a further link between Pynchon's poetics and a possible Lacanian one, because Pynchon's work is always concerned with death. One might even say obsessed with it. So much so that if one were to talk of a teleology in Pynchon's texts, it would have to be a teleology of death. All of Pynchon's works describe the failure and promise of such an encounter in constant evocations of threshold experiences between language and the real. As a result, language is forever beside the referent, a fact constantly thematized by Pynchon. In Gravity's Rainbow, for instance, he continually highlights the small but unbreachable gap between language and the real, with words only an eye twitch away from the things they stand for. That's quoted from Gravity's Rainbow. And pencil words only a delta T from the thing they stand for. Today, the fields of semiotics and political economy can no longer be separated because they have been subjected to the same underlying law, that of operational simulation. In a simulatory society, of which we could see Gravity's Rainbow as embodying, Baudrillard agrees with both Lacan and Derrida in believing that the process of signification is, at bottom, nothing but a gigantic simulation model of meaning. It is the growing operational simulation of reality, instigated by the identification of the real with the rational, within which Baudrillard theorizes the closure of the political field. Both Pynchon's and Baudrillard's anti-rational rhetorics are ultimately directed against this equation. It is only at the 0 point, with ascent and descent canceling each other out, that the quintuple zero and Gottfried can escape the Derridian or Derridian play of differences and the war of conflicting and competing forces. In all his works, Pynchon proceeds from the idea of a completely textualized universe in which the position of the subject directly depends on its position within discursive networks. As a result, the relation between language and subjectivity is essential to any interpretation of Pynchon's work. Lacan's psychoanalytic theory and his theory of language provide a basis for such an interpretation. Pynchon's Mythography, An Approach to Gravity's Rainbow by Catherine Hume. We've already looked at this once, but let's go through some highlights. Yet though he treats myth and mythology as dirty words and ridicules many cultural myths, he relies quite heavily for story and structure on his own mythographic pattern. And let me say right here, even though I've already started into it, this is a treat to read, kind of like Molly Height's book, which I'll get into next, Ideas of Order. These two women just speak so clearly and so lucidly about Pynchon. They're really gifted in taking these complex discourses and making them approachable. It's just really, it's scholarly literature that's a treat to read. She asserts that Pynchon's most original contribution to literature is a conception of a brand new hero myth. At least two crucial issues cannot be understood apart from myth. One, the nature of Pynchon's anti-empirical vision of the cosmos, on which depends much of the acceptability of what he says philosophically, and the implied messages or warnings promulgated by the mythology. When Ulysses first appeared, critics reacted most strongly to its dissonant and disturbing elements and stressed its negative effects. Only gradually did Joyce's positive elements also gain recognition. Any avant-garde work, because it rejects prior traditions, will embody violent negative attitudes, both philosophical and formal. However, the work is unlikely to command interest for long if it does not stand for some values as well as against others. And so Hume asserts that Gravity's Rainbow would soon lose its fascination were it only anti-modernist, were it not constructive as well as explosive. His world has a strong downward tendency toward the demonic. His underworlds render more explicit visions than his high places. As a result, Gravity's Rainbow is better at telling us what is wrong than in advising us how to better the situation. It also has this strong downward tendency toward the demonic because of gravitational pull. Pynchon tells this basic story with at least 4 concerns in mind. One is cultural history. The second is the personal history of Tyrone Slothrop. The third, the history of the V2. And the fourth, the history of technology in general. And for an even better summation of the plot, those are the 4 different elements that could be pulled together. I pretty much, earlier when I tried to have a go at saying what it's about, what the plot is, I only picked at one of those, or 2 of those rather. Slothrop and Chicherin. Chicherin is the Soviet operative who is after Enzian, who ends up being his half-brother, involved in the Slothrop plot. But they are both haunted by a fear of blacks. Slothrop's fears being just general fears and general racism that's been imparted to him. But Chicherin's being centered on his half-brother. Again, that's Enzian. 0 versus 1. The archetypal binary opposition appears early in the novel and is obviously freighted with significance. Pynchon does not abolish the extremes in order to exalt an excluded middle. Rather, he implies that we must somehow strive to integrate, or at least accept all the possibilities. And, that's rendered as and/and, rather than either/or. And this came out, I believe, in 1987. Yes, this book, Catherine Hume's Pynchon's Mythography, came out in 1997, as the same year that Thomas More's The Style of Connectedness came out. And interestingly, Hume gets at this and, whereas More, as we'll see, offers a both or both and. One of the most original elements of Pynchon's mythography is his refusal to accept this almost universal hero monomyth. And that hero monomyth she's talking about refers to Joseph Campbell's conception of the hero with 1,000 faces. And so, there's this traditional hero monomyth that is supposed to go into these, especially quest plots, but Pynchon upends it. While certain details bespeak a general Wagnerian influence, it is not the heroes from the Ring cycle who appear in Pynchon's system of traditional heroes, but Tannhauser, and, via allusions to the Grail, Parsifal. Ihab Hassan, following Nietzsche, argues that literary form must periodically be rent with Dionysian violence if writers in our repressed Apollonian culture are to be able to sing at all. Hence, he identifies the condition of modern writers in general with the dismembered head of Orpheus. And you'll read this a lot, especially in light of Pynchon criticism and his use of Orpheus in Gravity's Rainbow. Because, with the birth of tragedy that Nietzsche gave us, he gave us this wonderful consideration of culture and of art as being sort of this dialectic between Dionysus, which represents just wild abandon and reverie, and then Apollo, or the Dionysian and the Apollonian. Apollo representing the more conservative and the orderly. And between those two, we have the cult of Orpheus. Slothrop is an aggregate of possible responses to reality. So that's why I believe that Slothrop, for all the negative criticism that's been thrown at him as not really a full character, not really, going anywhere. In fact, he is, like she says, an aggregate of possible responses to reality. And so he's an everyman and an everywoman at all times. The Ideas of Order in the Novels of Thomas Pynchon by Molly Haidt. I highly recommend this book. It is wonderful. Again, like some others, she gives this personal anecdote. I was astonished to learn much later that Pynchon is frequently criticized for being the academic's academic, or the writer's writer. The writer whose books are intended to be taught, not read. But for a long time, the most ardent Pynchon fans that I knew were a weightlifter, a short order cook, and a pizza delivery man. Pynchon's narratives are, in addition, about order, about its presence or absence, about order as object of desire, dread, fantasy, or hallucination, about what order means, how it is apprehended, and what it entails. His works thus tend to comment on themselves. His own fictional worlds are pluralistic, governed not by a rigid, absolute, and universal idea of order, but by multiple partial, overlapping, and often conflicting ideas of order. Problematic knots in the plot refuse to unravel, and thus no denouement, literally an untying, can occur. As the narrator declares on the first page, this is not a disentanglement from, but a progressive knotting into. Pynchon refuses to establish a hierarchy among the cacophony of voices in Gravity's Rainbow. Thus, some of our bewilderment as readers, because as we're going through the book, there's no omniscient, omnipresent narrator to sort of guide us as to whose voice is more authoritative than others. In Gravity's Rainbow, synthesis and control are the hallmarks of structures favoring death. The rocket heralds what Slothrop's Puritan ancestors would have regarded as a new covenant, a new agreement between humanity and the omnipotent hand, capital H hand, that in the novel's closing hymn turns the time. That is a wonderful, wonderful proposition, that the rocket heralds what Slothrop's Puritan ancestors would have regarded as a new covenant, a new agreement by this transcendent power and humanity. So the rocket is ushering in a third covenant with mankind. Because Hitler had a dream that the V2 would never fly, the scientists at Peenemünde lost their funding for 2 years, an event that significantly retarded rocket development. Authorities from both sides have agreed that if the Fuhrer had not treated his dream as prophecy, Germany might well have won the war. I know I said something about that earlier, but it's just really stunning to sit back and think about something like that. Where did that dream come from? By adopting a present tense mode of narration, he, the narrator or Pynchon, can treat the past as a present that was. From inside, history has any number of shapes or plots pointing in all directions, which is to say that when the subject is secular history, there are no authorized versions. That's perfect. The narrative voice in Gravity's Rainbow is thus barred from the usual historian's retrospective insight. This is a mandatory book on the shelf of all Pynchon fans, Gravity's Rainbow readers. This is Luke Herman and Stephen Weisenburger, Gravity's Rainbow, Domination, and Freedom. There's also a little review of it in Stephen Moore's My Back Pages, which is where I first heard about it. But this is just great reading. It really gets into the depths of the counterculture, or just the culture in general, the subversive culture, the political turmoil that was going on worldwide, and especially in America, around the time that Pynchon was writing Gravity's Rainbow. Pynchon produced some of the most outrageous and daring scenes of satirical representation known in 20th century fiction. And, as with all great satire, he could be deadly serious. And that's what's so crazy about Gravity's Rainbow. It can be so off the wall and hilarious, yet at the same time extremely serious. This is sort of like reminds me of Freud's notion of the paraprax, or sublimating fears and anxieties into jokes. The novel mixes sex, drugs, and rocketry to develop a satirical fable fired back at the West's abiding, deathly legacy, which is perpetual war and its creation of masses who, if not actually dead, are nonetheless socially dead, without rights, and at times bluntly, but more often subtly, dominated by forms of soft power, a condition some characters in the novel have been persuaded perversely to desire. Pynchon is a 50s Navy veteran, and he did yeoman's labor in the military-industrial complex at Boeing as a technical writer on intercontinental ballistic missiles in the company's pilotless aircraft division. We aren't persuaded by claims the novel aligns itself or sutures itself to 60s countercultural efforts merely to escape from technocratic life through forms of libidinal, spontaneous, and non-discursive expression. In other words, that suturing may have stood out to you because of an excerpt I read earlier from Lines of Flight by Stefan Matisic. And so they're basically going against Matisic as being too reductive. Readers may thus ponder the ending in two contexts. First, the moon race triumph in July 1969, led by a NASA team under the direction of former Nazi rocketeer Wernher von Braun. Who could make such stuff up, they say, parenthetically. Second, that famous closing shot in Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, as cowboy hat-waving Major Kong rides a nuclear bomb down into a Russian city as if he were astride a bucking bronco. To which associations we also add, during the war, a V-2 really did come down with horrific results on a movie theater in Antwerp. I actually didn't know this before I read this book, but Pynchon was on the FBI watch list, or the security index list. Germanic folklore, the Wandervogel youth movement, and the Duino elegies, which Weismann has subjected to a relentlessly solipsistic and romanticized reading. These intertexts signal the ways that Weismann's manias are culturally encoded. So again, I go back to Pynchon's exhaustive research into Germany and reconstructing the feeling of the culture and the depths of the culture, are showing how these manias and these neuroses that can lead to catastrophic ends are in large part culturally encoded. The novel is political through and through and never takes its eyes off the machine, Malach, the system. As a steel erection, the V2 appeals to young men who wish to compensate for their impotence with dreams of technological power, unaware of the violence inherent to the project. Hence the whole taxonomy of phallic devices, the phallic taxonomy, from the V2 rocket to bananas and on and on and on. So often the narration gives one the feeling of being buried under a rubble of words naming things, concepts, techniques, and peoples. Words with no clear reason for being tumbled together, and that challenge us, therefore, to seek meaningful order and readerly control. That task is all the more challenging, alluring, as Pynchon's verbal embrace draws in so many nouns from technical jargons, historically specific slangs, and foreign languages. That perfectly explains one of the big draws of reading Gravity's Rainbow for me. Unlike the full detailing of Weismann's tarot 8 pages later, we aren't told the significator, that is, a specific card, that the diviner deliberately selected from the unshuffled deck to symbolize the client's query, also unknown, for sloth ride. A previously overlooked motif that runs from early to final episodes of Gravity's Rainbow, divination, represents ways of knowing that are radically different from modern science and stand outside of Western epistemology, which organizes meaning, deciding, acting, progress, fortune, and history according to deeply entrenched, individualistic, deterministic, and teleological frames. Crucially, unlike Western religions in general, divinatory practices are not based in eschatology, in an ideal or myth of last things that imperatively orients one to ordinary things in the here and now. In divinatory practices, it's never too late to change course or oneself. They make a great case for divination in Gravity's Rainbow, seances and tarot, astrology, and so on. The rocket's parabolic flight path, arcing from the first to the last page, tropes the arc of Gravity's Rainbow, with a beginning or launch, the middle or Brennschluss of Slothrop's and the counterforce's feeble lurches at freedom, and an end, one instant before the impact on the Orpheus Theater. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. Pynchon's ear is attuned to modern rock and roll, country, folk, jazz, and blues, as well as to classical music and opera. In 1859, he applied to the Ford Foundation for a grant to work on a libretto. An application the foundation declined, whereupon he found employment at Boeing and began writing about rockets. And they say, as kind of an aside, an ethically troubling business that the novel might be read as redressing. The first V-2 missiles fired against Antwerp struck in early October 1944 as German forces sought to thwart Allied uses of the Scheldt River port to resupply troops. This is some of what it meant to be human in late 1944 and early 1945, under the reign of such incredible new weaponry. Pynchon's novel evokes this new world, which is not brave, but exists under a dark, new cloud of not knowing. This new dispensation, or rocket state cosmology, is laying down fresh rules. That is a perfect explanation of what Gravity's Rainbow is. And finally, The Style of Connectedness by Thomas More. Gravity's Rainbow and Thomas Pynchon. I'm actually not quite through with this. I'm in the middle of the last chapter, but today is my day to record, so I'll just give the highlights that I have so far. Gravity's Rainbow is among the most widely celebrated, unread novels of the past 30 years. By the way, there's a lot packed into this book. I highly, highly recommend it. It's one of my top recommendations. Although I don't agree with all of its different positions, it is very thorough and fun to read and laden with anecdotes. The effect is simultaneously of pedantry and a parody of it, factual scrupulousness and irreverent offhandedness about facts, a stylistic instance of Pynchon's habit of insinuating the inclusion of all manner of phenomena in their opposites, yin and yang, or as I call them, both and effects. Our media painfully mediate us away from each other's concrete realities as much as they unite us within the terms of their truth. Boy, this was written in 1987. It could be written today. I'm going to read it again. Our media outlets, the people who control media, painfully mediate us away from each other's concrete realities as much as they unite us within the terms of their truth. Really think about that. Of all living writers, perhaps the nearest to Pynchon imaginatively is Jorge Luis Borges. The films of most consistent use to Pynchon are the movie musicals of the 30s and 40s, self-consciously choreographed for widescreen effects in vulgarly precise style. And these just happen randomly throughout the novel. The most common general complaint about Pynchon's characterization is that in his books it is precisely such imperatives of abstract and abstracting design and theme that prevent the characters from seeming really characterized, and even the books as wholes from seeming humane. Blissero's imagination is wholly of sky, hardly at all connected to the book's earthly life. Whatever rises simply to escape and negate gravity will be thrown back to the earth that, as Rilke affirmed, is the matrix both of life and death. Laszlo Yanf is the one who did the experimentation on the young Slothrop with the Imipex G, or at least some kind of forerunner of Imipex G. But Yanf is also the role model of Pointsman. Says Yanf is the novel's creation, as is the oil plant named for him. But the Lunawerke was one of the installations really built by the IG, meaning the IG Farben cartel, so that Hitler could conduct his war without undue concern about fuel supplies. And other historical facts like that, plus also as the limitation of food supplies because all the potatoes went to make alcohol for the rockets, things like that. It's another reason for reading Pynchon. At its height, IG Farben, the cartel controlled about 350 German firms, had linkages with more than 500 foreign firms, and was the biggest and strongest industrial organization in the world. In Pynchon's zone, any throwaway line may encrypt just such historical data. So yeah, it's one of these where every line, every word is used. It's honestly not superfluous, and it's not gratuitous, even though it certainly seems so. As the potential energy stored in its fuel is converted to kinetic energy in burning, the rocket ascends against gravity. That is, it lives precisely in the fashion of the ideal man-machine of the 19th century, which, as Weiner explains, is the heat engine. And so this is linking the V2 rocket of Gravity's Rainbow, of historical reality, with Shelley's Frankenstein. The omnivorous symbolism of Melville's white whale is recapitulated and even pushed a step further by Pynchon's rocket. Designated acutely by Poirier as Moby Dick and the Pequod in one. V2 is not only nature's raw chaos of all colors or of no color, behind which the final secret of 1 and 0 lurks. It is, as well, mind's attempt to project itself as counter-entropic ordering impulse onto the chaos. Further, its deathliness is the sign of mind's dread of order once projected. Mind's suspicion that its own characteristically energetic life is somehow a pernicious fiction or deep subversion of all universal creation pledged helplessly to the increase of disorder. And this is one thing, I don't know if you're picking up on it or not, but one thing I love about Thomas More's book is that he will give you a lot of information, just a hoard of information and references. And then he'll come in with this perfect synthesis of everything that he's just given you. In general, Gravity's Rainbow uses the German tension between integrating and differentiating to define post-Romantic German history as, on the whole, a synecdoche for post-Renaissance Western man. To the mystery, mysticism, oniromancy, and magic to be felt everywhere in Gravity's Rainbow, the first entryways, as we would expect, are such worlds through whose frames we feel bending incursions, like notes through harmonica holes, of numinous realms outside, where all meanings, all metaphors, somehow are one. And that's a fantastic allusion, a double allusion to Slothrop when he finds the harmonica that appears in the stream in the Harz in Germany, and also Orpheus and his harp. Well, this is kind of cool. You are now in an unexpected moment of my Gravity's Rainbow video because I just received, and look, it matches my purple shirt. I just received at my door an order that I placed because so many of this Pynchon criticism referenced two very, very early books. One would be Joseph Slade's monograph on Thomas Pynchon, and the other would be Tony Tanner's. Both are really well lauded, and they're both out of print. But I was able to secure a copy of each, and it appears that the Joseph Slade book arrived at my door in the middle of making this video. So that's pretty cool. And I figured I would open it with you here. So sliding this out, page protector. Gave me a nice little note. There she is. Obviously, I didn't have time to read this important monograph in preparation for the video. Oh, look, there's a cool little note in here. Whoa, what is this? It's always fun to find stuff in here. So I think someone used this as a bookmark or something, and a postcard fell out of it. Anyhow, I didn't have time to include this in my literature review, but nonetheless, this is a very important book, and it's got that old book smell. Love it. That was fun to share that with you. Pretty cool that it just showed up like that. I am getting a little bit tired. Surely people will tell me I should have divided this into multiple different videos, but I just didn't feel like it. I wanted to take the day off work and just record the whole shebang in one shot. Nonetheless, let us proceed to a close reading and analysis of the first episode in Gravity's Rainbow. If you have never read it before, I invite you to take this opportunity to read it along with me. Or better yet, go and read the first episode. What I mean is in the Penguin Deluxe, this is just the very first handful of pages before you get to the, well, what would technically be the second series of little squares. Let's start with Beyond the Zero. All right, so, we've got right from the beginning, section 1 of 4 begins with the title Beyond the Zero. There's going to be a lot of meaning behind 0 and 1, and especially the mathematical paradox of there being an infinite number of subdivisions between 0 and 1. The whole, you can't really ever make it outside of a room because every time you get halfway closer, you're still subdividing in infinite numbers of ways. And then also Zeno's paradoxes come in here, the paradox of the arrow. Before we get into all that, I'm just going to pretend like we don't know that. And let's look at this epigraph that's used from Wernher von Braun, the rocket man, the ex-Nazi engineer who would lead NASA and America to the moon. It's really unthinkable. Nature does not know extinction. All it knows is transformation. So we see this is based right from the first law of thermodynamics. In a closed system, energy can't be created or annihilated. It can only be transformed. Everything science has taught me and continues to teach me strengthens my belief in the continuity of our spiritual existence after death, which is crazy, especially to our contemporary minds, that von Braun is using science to basically affirm a belief in the afterlife. But as we'll see, Pynchon very easily gives just as much weight to science as he does a seance. Here we go, the famous opening line, "A screaming comes across the sky." Why is that so novel? Well, it's because, first of all, he uses the definite article a, so we're talking about a very specific screaming. And then screaming, this is a gerund. This is a noun that's taken from a verb by putting ing on it. Comes across the sky. At first I would read this as, I would picture the rocket itself coming across the sky and screaming. But in a couple of pages, we realized that the reason it says a screaming comes across the sky is because the rocket has already hit. That was the novelty of the V2. It was supersonic. That is, it went faster than sound. So you would hear the screaming, you would hear the sound of the rocket after it hit, but only if you were still alive, of course. It has happened before, but there is nothing to compare it to now. It is too late. The evacuation still proceeds, but it's all theater. So again, we'll see this over and over. And this gives the book its circularity because it starts in a theater, a war theater, and ends in a theater, a movie theater. There are no lights inside the cars, no light anywhere. Of course, black being the absence of light, and rainbow being the spectrum, and then white being the entire spectrum of colors. This will all be important as we go along. Above him lift girders old as an iron queen, and glass somewhere far above that would let the light of day through. But it's night. He's afraid of the way the glass will fall. Soon, it will be a spectacle, the fall of a crystal palace. And we noted about the crystal palace earlier, and there's an allusion there to London and to actual historical event. But coming down in total blackout without one glint of light, only great invisible crashing. So I hope you already see how great the writing is, how much fun it is to read, how engaging. Inside the carriage, which is built on several levels, he sits in velveteen darkness, with nothing to smoke, feeling metal nearer and farther rub and connect, steam escaping in puffs, a vibration in the carriage's frame, a poising, an uneasiness, all the others pressed in around, feeble ones, second sheep, all out of luck and time. Drunks, old veterans still in shock from ordnance 20 years obsolete. Hustlers in city clothes, derelicts, exhausted women with more children than it seems could belong to anyone, stacked about among the rest of the things to be carried out to salvation. Carried out to salvation. What will be their salvation? Only the nearer faces are visible at all, and at that only as half-silvered images in a viewfinder. Green-stained VIP faces remembered behind bulletproof windows speeding through the city. And there we get our first set of ellipses. This is a very elliptical novel. You will see this a lot. They have begun to move. They pass in line, out of the main station, out of downtown, and begin pushing into older and more desolate parts of the city. Is this the way out? Faces turn to windows, but no one dares ask, not out loud. Rain comes down. No, this is not a disentanglement from, but a progressive nodding into. And that is very much descriptive of Gravity's Rainbow. This will be a constant, a progressive nodding into an eternal golden braid, if you will. They go on under archways, secret entrances of rotted concrete that only looked like loops of an underpass. Certain trestles of blackened wood have moved slowly by overhead, and the smells begun of coal from days far to the past. Smells of naphtha winters, of Sundays when no traffic came through, of the coral-like and mysteriously vital growth, around the blind curves and out the lonely spurs, a sour smell of rolling stock absence, of maturing rust, developing through those emptying days brilliant and deep, especially at dawn, with blue shadows to seal its passage, to try to bring events to absolute zero, or absolute stasis. And it is the poorer, the deeper they go. Ruinous secret cities of poor, places whose names he has never heard. The walls break down, the roofs get fewer, and so do the chances for light. The road, which ought to be opening out into a broader highway, instead has been getting narrower, more broken, cornering tighter and tighter until all at once, much too soon, they are under the final arch. Brakes grab and spring terribly. It is a judgment from which there is no appeal. And so you see entropy and the final death here in this road getting narrower and narrower, and the brakes grabbing and spring terribly, and the judgment from which there is no appeal. You feel this sense of breaking down, coming to the end of, this sense of doom and determinism for the preterite, that is. The caravan has halted. It is the end of the line. All the evacuees are ordered out. They move slowly but without resistance. Those marshalling them wear cockades the color of lead and do not speak. It is some vast, very old and dark hotel, an iron extension of the track and switchery by which they have come here. Globular lights, painted a dark green, hang from under the fancy iron eaves, unlit for centuries. And you see this parataxis that's in play here. This has been noted by a lot of people, but sort of like with a lot of major writers, Cormac McCarthy springs to mind too, this parataxis, which you're constantly adding an addendum, just adding to the list, your sentence just growing and growing by these appositions and concatenations. The crowd moves without murmurs or coughing down corridors straight and functional as warehouse aisles. Velvet black surfaces, that harkens back to that velveteen darkness, contain the movement. The smell is of old wood, of remote wings empty all this time, just reopened to accommodate the rush of souls. Of cold plaster where all the rats have died, only their ghosts, still as cave painting, fixed stubborn and luminous in the walls. The evacuees are taken in lots, by elevator, a moving wood scaffold open on all sides, hoisted by old tarry ropes and cast iron pulleys, whose spokes are shaped like S's. And this is a capital S with a small s, no apostrophe, to give the plural of an S or an S shape. So if you picture that, you see it as SS, as in the Nazi SS, but also as a double integral sign from mathematics, which will come up later in the book. At each brown floor, passengers move on and off. Thousands of these hushed rooms without light. Some wait alone, some share their invisible rooms with others. Invisible, yes, what do the furnishings matter at this stage of things? Underfoot crunches the oldest of city dirt, last crystallizations of all the city had denied, threatened, lied to its children. Each has been hearing a voice, one he thought was talking only to him, say, "You didn't really believe you'd be saved. Come, we all know who we are by now. No one was ever going to take the trouble to save you, old fellow. There is no way out. Lie and wait. Lie still and be quiet." Screaming holds across the sky. When it comes, it will come in darkness. Or will it bring its own light? Will light come before or after? And notice here, all of a sudden, the narrative, this sort of doom-infused narrative, starts to then putter into these questions, where suddenly it's a screaming holds across the sky, and then when it comes, will it come in darkness? Or will it bring its own light? Will the light come before or after? All of a sudden, the rational forces are starting to engage. And the next paragraph, but it is already light. How long has it been light? All this while, light has come percolating in, along with the cold morning air flowing across his nipples. Stop. For the first time, reader, at least for me, when I read his nipples, it was so unexpected to get that image and to get that moment that I realized this is one way that Pynchon is signaling a shift in the narrative. And we can see in that previous paragraph with the questions that start to kick in, what's happening is, as we'll learn in a second, Captain Jeffrey Pirate Prentice is starting to wake up from a dream. And as he's waking up, his rational faculty is starting to kick in, and he's starting to rationalize and question things about what he's dreaming. And then that cold light coming in and hitting across his nipples is our signal that we're awake now. It has begun to reveal an assortment of drunken wastrels, that is the daylight, the real daylight coming in. Some in uniform and some not, clutching empty or near empty bottles. Here draped over a chair, there huddled into a cold fireplace, or sprawled on various divans, unhoovered rugs and chaise lounges, down the different levels of the enormous room, snoring and wheezing at many rhythms and self-renewing chorus, as London light, winter and elastic light, grows between the faces of the mullioned windows, grows among the strata of last night's smoke still hung fading from the waxed beams of the ceiling. All these horizontal here, these comrades in arms, look just as rosy as a bunch of Dutch peasants dreaming of their certain resurrection in the next few minutes. Whew. There's so much going on in there. First of all, it's just pleasant to the ear. I hope you can hear how pleasant the prose is to the ear. But there's so much going on with the interesting and fresh way that Pynchon is describing things. His name is Captain Jeffrey Pirate Prentice. He is wrapped in a thick blanket, a tartan of orange, rust, and scarlet. His skull feels made of metal. Just above him, 12 feet overhead, Teddy Bloat is about to fall out of the minstrel's gallery, having chosen to collapse just at the spot where somebody in a grandiose fit weeks before had kicked out 2 of the ebony balusters. Now, in his stupor, Bloat has been inching through the opening, head, arms, and torso, until all that's keeping him up there is an empty champagne split in his hip pocket that's got hooked somehow. By now, Pirate has managed to sit up on his narrow bachelor bed and blink about. How awful. How bloody awful. And we'll note that the narrator isn't giving us an italicized text here when it says how awful, how bloody awful, and then an ellipsis. It's just simply portraying Pirate's thoughts. Above him, he hears cloth rip. The special operations executive has trained him to fast responses. He leaps off the cot and kicks it rolling on its casters in Bloat's direction. Bloat, plummeting, hits square amidships with a great strum of bed streams. So this is theatrical. Everything is theater. It's slapstick and situational comedy. One of the legs collapses. "Good morning," notes Pirate. Bloat smiles briefly and goes back to sleep, snuggling well into Pirate's blanket. So we're already getting a signal of behavioral conditioning. Like it said, the SOE trained him to fast responses. And this was a very fast and precise response indeed. We'll see that all throughout the novel, there's been behavioral conditioning. Bloat is one of the co-tenants of the place, a maisonette erected last century not far from the Chelsea embankment by Corydon Throsp, an acquaintance of the Rossettis, who wore hair smocks and liked to cultivate pharmaceutical plants up on the roof. A tradition young Osby Field has lately revived. A few of them hardy enough to survive fogs and frosts, but most returning as fragments of peculiar alkaloids to rooftop earth, along with manure from a trio of prize Wessex saddleback sows quartered there by Throsp's successor, and dead leaves off many decorative trees transplanted to the roof by later tenants, and the odd, unstomachable meal thrown or vomited there by this or that sensitive Epicurean, all got scumbled together eventually by the knives of the seasons to an impasto, feet thick, of unbelievable black topsoil in which anything could grow, not the least being bananas. Pirate, driven to despair by the wartime banana shortage, decided to build a glass hothouse on the roof and persuade a friend who flew the Rio to Ascension to Fort Lamy Run to pinch him a sapling banana tree or two in exchange for a German camera, should Pirate happen across one in his next mission by parachute. Pirate has become famous for his banana breakfasts. Messmates throng here from all over England, even some who are allergic or outright hostile to bananas, just to watch. For the politics of bacteria, the soil's stringing of rings and chains in nets only God can tell the meshes of, have seen the fruit thrive often to lengths of 1.5 feet. Yes, amazing, but true. And right there we see that Pynchon takes us down to the molecular level, and we're starting to see the micropolitics and microeconomics of culture in the culturing of soil to grow bananas. So again, these are heady, weighty topics, yet infused in this slapstick comedy with puerile symbols such as bananas. Pirate in the lavatory stands pissing, without a thought in his head. Then he threads himself into a wool robe he wears inside out so as to keep his cigarette pocket hidden. Not that this works too well. Encircling the warm bodies of friends makes his way to French windows, slides outside into the cold, groans as it hits the fillings in his teeth. What a great image to give us the sense of just how cold this London winter is in 1944. Climbs a spiral ladder, ringing to the roof garden, and stands for a bit, watching the river. The sun is still below the horizon. The day feels like rain, but for now the air is uncommonly clear. And of course, like I said, Pynchon's meticulous use of the Times of London is informing him about this day and its weather. The great power station and the gasworks beyond stand precisely. Crystals grown in morning's beaker, stacks, vents, towers, plumbing, gnarled emissions of steam and smoke. So we see again this symbol of the mechanics, the mechanization of the world in which they live. Pirate in a voiceless roar, watching his breath slip away over the parapets. Rooftops dance in the morning. His giant bananas cluster, radiant yellow, humid green. His companions below dream drooling of a banana breakfast. This well-scrubbed day ought to be no worse than any. Will it? Here is a moment, one of the moments of great narrative. Far to the east, down in the pink sky, something has just sparked very brightly. A new star, nothing less noticeable. He leans on the parapet to watch. The brilliant point has already become a short vertical white line. It must be somewhere out over the North Sea, at least that far. Ice fields below and a cold smear of sun. This is a beautiful description. What is it? Nothing like this ever happens, but Pirate knows it. After all, he has seen it in a film just in the last fortnight. It's a vapor trail, already a finger's width higher now, so note the perspectivism. But not from an airplane. Airplanes are not launched vertically. This is the new and still most secret German rocket bomb, or the V2. Incoming mail. Did he whisper that or only think it? He tightens the ragged belt of his robe. Well, the range of these things is supposed to be over 200 miles. You can't see a vapor trail 200 miles now, can you? Oh, oh yes. Around the curve of the Earth, farther east, the sun over there, just risen over in Holland, is striking the rocket's exhaust, drops in crystals, making them blaze clear across the sea. This is a beautiful moment where, when he realizes what it must be, he then has a moment of self doubt, and then he thinks about, wait a second, the curvature of the Earth. The sun is below the horizon line of what I can see, but it's behind the vapor trail of this rocket. So the sun is illuminating the vapor trail coming behind the rocket so that I can see it. The white line abruptly has stopped its climb. That would be fuel cutoff, end of burning. What's their word? Brennschluss. We don't have one, or else it's classified. The bottom of the line, the original star, has already begun to vanish in red daybreak. But the rocket will be here before Pirate sees the sunrise. The trail, smudged, slightly torn in 2 or 3 directions, hangs in the sky. Already the rocket, gone pure ballistic, has risen higher, but invisible now. So we feel this dread where we can track the vapor trail. What can be seen, can be coped with better than what cannot be seen. But now, like he said, the vapor trail has cut at Brennschluss, and now the rocket is ballistic. We don't know. And furthermore, we won't hear it come in. Oughtn't he to be doing something? Get on to the operations room at Stanmore? They must have it on the channel radars. No time really. Less than 5 minutes, hog to here, meaning from the hog to here in London. The time it takes to walk down to the tea shop on the corner. For light from the sun to reach the planet of love. No time at all. Run out into the street, warn the others, pick bananas. So we see his decision is to pick bananas in the face of this V2. Now, part of it seems absurd, but part of it is also pointing to the fact that they are in Blitzkrieg London. So we're getting the horrors of it, and we're also getting the view of what it's like to be desensitized to it and to be given over to fate, as it were. He trudges through black compost into the hothouse. He feels he's about to shite. The missile, 60 miles high, must be coming up on the peak of its trajectory now, beginning its fall now. And we use ellipses to give that feeling of time passing. Trusswork is pierced by daylight. Milky panes beam beneficently down. How could there be a winter, even this one, gray enough to age this iron that can sing in the wind, or cloud these windows that open into another season, however falsely preserved? A beautiful paragraph. Pirate looks at his watch. Nothing registers. The pores of his face are prickling, emptying his mind. A commando trick. He steps into the wet heat of his bananery, sets about picking the ripest and the best, holding up the skirt of his robe to drop them in, allowing himself to count only bananas, moving bare-legged among the pendulous bunches, among these yellow chandeliers, this tropical twilight. Out into winter again. The contrail is gone entirely from the sky. Pirate sweat lies on his skin almost as cold as ice. He takes some time lighting a cigarette. He won't hear the thing come in. It travels faster than the speed of sound. The first news you get of it is the blast. Then, if you're still around, you hear the sound of it coming in. What if it should hit exactly... no. For a split second, you'd have to feel the very point, with the terrible mass above, strike the top of the skull. ... Pirate hunches his shoulders, bearing his bananas down the corkscrew ladder. One thing that's remarkable about this opening episode is how well, in just a few pages, Pynchon invites us into his world. If it's the first time you're reading it, it can feel disorienting. But at the same time, the prose is so good that you realize this is a great writer and this is important stuff. All the symbolism is laid out for us. The concept of causality that will follow you all through the novel. The concept of cause and effect, of Dr. Pointsman, the great Pavlovian, who wants nothing more than to win a Nobel Prize for figuring out why there is an inverse causality between Slothrop's erections and the incoming V2 rockets. He wants everything to be in a great deterministic causal chain of events from beginning to end, sequence. So a series, even though Lenny Pokler will tell us later, it's parallelism. It's not series. It's not linearity. You've got that here. You've got the behavioral conditioning of cause and effect on display. You've got the one and the zero and getting beyond the zero, but in which direction? You've got love and death locked up. Eros and Thanatos, life and death, are all wrapped up in this rocket. You've also got a horrific depiction of the preterite, or those who are left behind and passed over as the elect in wartime London to go to their death, or as it's referred to here, perhaps their salvation from the life that they're living. Perhaps the incoming V2 is a means of salvation for the people it will hit. We're also again seeing how the narrator is just sort of this roving eye that just oscillates and jumps from here and there, and it'll jump into the mind of any given character at any given moment and deliver that character's thoughts as if it's still the narrator. This is something that Diane Williams does in her flash fiction or micro fiction, where the narrator will just sort of infiltrate everybody around, and it can jump into the mind of a stranger looking back at the people that the narrator was just describing. And you have to read closely because of it. Steven Weisenburger also shows how there's a circularity to many of the episodes where there's a focal point or a character through which the narrative focalizes. And then as the narrative diffuses and goes into other characters, it will eventually come back and sort of close the circle. Not always, but very often. All right, now I'm going to sit back a little farther than I usually do, and I'm going to go through my reading notes from beginning to end. First of all, I want to talk about this opening and the closing. So the opening, we have a screaming comes across the sky. And, when we're first reading this, and the traditional interpretation or the standard way to read this is that this is a dream, or rather a nightmare, that Pirate Prentice is having. And he wakes up from this horrific dream. But then he walks outside to go to his bananery, or his banana hothouse, and he sees a V2 rocket being launched from Holland. And toward the end of the episode, he has this moment of fear, of phobia, where he imagines feeling the tip of a V2 rocket bearing down right on the top of his head and feeling the unbelievable weight of the rocket behind it. This hints at, of course, as we would actually experience it, you would never feel that, never actually register it. I mean, if a rocket landed right on top of your head, you'd just be crushed, it would be over. But it's hinting at the subdivision of time into infinite moments, or infinite frames in a film, if you will. And so, if we slice up a parabolic trajectory of a rocket into all these, what Pynchon refers to as delta T's, or this change in time from one time to another, there would have to be a delta T frame in there where you would, in fact, have the tip of the thing pressing down onto your skull. Now, this is also interesting because in the closing episode, The Descent, we have a rocket. In fact, it is the quintuple zero that was fired in 1945 and now appears in 1972 or 73 Los Angeles over top of the fictional Orpheus Theater. We have it captured, and it's in that same kind of frame that Prentice is worrying about. The point of this rocket is caught poised in stasis in that final delta T before it explodes, hovering right above all of us in the theater. And in fact, that's this last moment where the people in the theater are singing a song in the face of impending doom. And then the narrator turns to us and says, now everybody. And there's this M dash. And so we don't know if that means that it's inviting us to sing. Perhaps it's inviting us to use song, an Orphic song, to live in this infinite delta T, thus escaping the next delta T of explosion, or if this means that that M dash after now everybody means that it's over, the rocket hit, and we're done. But whichever way you go with, there's an awesome circularity here where you can almost imagine, because again, Pirate Prentice, we find out in a handful of more pages after the first episode that he is a surrogate fantasist. That is, he has this really odd power, if you will, where he has people's dreams and people's fantasies come through his mind as a surrogate. So could it be that this very opening episode is in fact not a nightmare, but in fact someone's fantasy or dream? And whose fantasy or dream would it be other than perhaps Captain Blissero? So I assert that it's the same rocket, the quintuple zero, the same rocket that's being launched at the end of the book by Blissero with Gottfried in there, or God's Peace in there. Blissero's having that moment of fantasy of what this is to be. And I believe that that fantasy, that moment that he's imagining is what Pirate Prentice is picking up here at the beginning of this episode. I mean, every way I go with this, I find holes and I find issues with it, but it's an interesting thought nonetheless, that it's the same rocket and he's having this fantasy filtered through him. And then the rocket transcends time, so it's able to show up, 3 decades later. And of course, it tells us that Gottfried here at the end in the descent, it was not a star. It was a bright angel of death. And okay, Gottfried is the angel of death. He's dressed in all white lace, white slippers and all this. But at the same time, in the first episode, that's what the narrator, focalizing through Pirate, tells us, is that it's like a morning star. It's a star. And so we see that symbolism come back here, and it negates it. It says, but it was not a star. So it's almost as if the narrator is assuming that we realize that this rocket is the same as the one Prentice was seeing. And furthermore, it says the rocket reaches its last unmeasurable gap, that is the delta T, last delta T, above the roof of this old theater. And so that again echoes that theater of the first page. In fact, I think it's something like the third sentence, or I guess it's the fourth sentence. It says the evacuation still proceeds, but it's all theater. I don't know, something that constantly hounds my thoughts. So let's skip over the first episode and I'll just pick up with my reading notes after that. Listen to this beautiful descriptive language. Flagstones are slippery with mist. It is the dark, hard, tobacco-starved, heady, sour-stomach middle of the day. A million bureaucrats are diligently plotting death, and some of them even know it. Towards the end of World War II, this is how Pynchon captures just seeing citizens walking around in a city or a metropolis, if you will, and it's saying a million bureaucrats are diligently plotting death, and some of them even know it. So here we hint at Franz Pokler, who his wife upbraids him about working for the Nazis at Peenemünde on this rocket program, because she's trying to tell him, don't you realize they're using you to create a weapon to kill people? But, you're so weak and you're so caught up in all this other stuff. You're the exact type of person that they want. They want someone who's pliable. If they're really set on getting him, they, the capital T, they, embracing possibilities far beyond Nazi Germany. That's the surest way. Doesn't cost them a thing to paint his name on every one, right? They embracing possibilities far beyond Nazi Germany. That's the thing about this book. people have criticized it for not, I guess, properly shaming Hitler or shaming the Nazis enough. But really, as some of our critics and scholars have shown us, Pynchon is looking beyond just Nazi Germany. He's looking at what underlies the powers and the culture that made Nazi Germany possible. And it's far beyond just the Nazis. And he looks into nonetheless, he looks into the military-industrial complex. A great line delivered by Roger Mexico. Roger Mexico he's just such a likable character. He's very rational. He's not at the level of Pointsman. In fact, he sort of, he counterpoints Pointsman. And Roger Mexico says, "My mother is the war." I love that. My mother is the war. And it goes on and on with this thing between Roger Mexico and Jessica Swan Lake. She's got another guy, Jeremy Beaver, I think, and she ends up getting, going back to him. Though it's the war that brings them together. And there's actually a very touching moment we'll get to in a little bit where Pynchon captures a very deep emotional moment for Mexico. Roger's only a statistician. Never had a prophetic dream, never sent or got a telepathic message, never touched the other world directly. If anything's there, it will show in the experimental data, won't it? In the numbers. That's what Mexico's all about. He's a statistician. If there's something there, it'll show in the data. And in fact, what it's referring to is the fact that we are at a seance right now. In this seance, Pynchon will give us the side of history of the seance taking place in the now, and he'll show us the other side through the control, Peter Sasha, I think, back into 1920s Germany. It's really fascinating. But anyway, Mexico's there at the seance to try and capture some data. And he's trying to see if there is something, that they're channeling. Pavlov was fascinated with ideas of the opposite, and so too is Pointsman and Kevin, I forgot his name, the other Pavlovian. It'll come to me. But anyway, Thomas Pynchon's obsessed with opposites, the dialectical. Imagine a missile one hears approaching only after it explodes. The reversal, a piece of time neatly snipped out. A few feet of film run backwards. So we know from the literature review how loaded that phrase is. The blast of the rocket, fallen faster than sound, then growing out of it the roar of its own fall, catching up to what's already death and burning, a ghost in the sky. Spectro, Kevin Spectro, that's his name. We have this scene where Pointsman is trying to catch a dog, and he works in the ARF unit, which is the abreaction research facility. Abreaction is a neurosis brought on by wartime trauma. Early on, snaring himself a dozen underlings. Dog trainer from the variety stage. Fresh dogs a week. A dozen fresh dogs a week. Why is he doing this? Well, because of Pavlov's dog. So we have this comical moment of Pointsman, this serious scientist who's trying to figure out the causality, figure out how to reconcile this reverse causality that the V2 rocket has imposed on him in order to win a Nobel Prize. But he's running around in this scene with a toilet bowl stuck to one of his feet, and he's trying to catch a dog so that he can use it in his laboratory. I mean, it's again just Pynchonian slapstick. It was widely believed in those days that behind the war, all the death, savagery, and destruction, lay the Führer principle. But if personalities could be replaced by abstractions of power, if techniques developed by the corporations could be brought to bear, might not nations live rationally? One of the dearest post-war hopes, that there should be no room for a terrible disease like charisma, that its rationalization should proceed while we had the time and resources. And when it says a terrible disease like charisma, it's pointing exactly to how people fell under the spell of the Führer, of Hitler. He had apparently an amazing amount of charisma. And to a German nation that was suffering from war reparations coming out of the First Great War to runaway inflation, to have this person with so much charisma and so much enthusiasm, same thing Mussolini was doing in Italy, it became something horrible. This is Brigadier Pudding and Pointsman, and poor Brigadier Pudding. He is the one who will have to undergo the most notorious moment, the coprophagic moment in the whole text. This is Pudding and Pointsman. They're also, putting him through different experiments. Pudding. But isn't this Pointsman, sir? Pudding. Isn't all this rather shabby, Pointsman, meddling with another man's mind this way? Pointsman. Brigadier, we're only following in a long line of experiment and questioning. Harvard University, the U.S. Army, hardly shabby institutions. Both of those institutions, of course, are strongly implicated throughout the entire narrative fabric of this novel. Pudding. We can't, Pointsman. It's beastly. Pointsman. But the Americans have already been at him. They're talking about Slothrop. Don't you see? It's not as if we're corrupting a virgin or something. Pudding. Do we have to do it because the Americans do it? Must we allow them to corrupt us? Because Pointsman and Brigadier Pudding and Pirate Prentice and others are British. You got to wonder, some people may wonder, why all the childishness with the erections and so on? Well, we get a rational explanation from Pointsman. He says, a hard-on. That's either there or it isn't. It's binary, elegant. The job of observing it can even be done by a student. So it's just a control factor, or a variable for experimentation that's binary. It doesn't have degrees. It's either there or it's not. Of course, you get these other views from other characters of what exactly it is. Whereas Pointsman is a staunch behavioralist. He's saying, this is because of some conditioning. He, in fact, believes that Laszlo Yanf, who first conditioned Slothrop's erections to coincide with something to do with this Imiplix G, he's saying that he thinks Yanf actually didn't go far enough, that it was actually a false positive, that he had reversed all the behavioral conditioning, that in fact he had not. But a character named Rollo Grost, he thinks that it's precognition. Slothrop is able to predict when a rocket will fall at a particular place. However, Edwin Treacle, that most Freudian of psychical researchers, we're told, thinks Slothrop's gift is psychosis or psychokinesis. Slothrop is, with the force of his mind, causing the rockets to drop where they do. Nonetheless, Roger's map of the robot blitz coincides again with the Poisson distribution. So for him, it's a bit, it's just a mathematical pattern. It's both random and determined. But the next great breakthrough may come when we have the courage to junk cause and effect entirely and strike off at some other angle. And that is Mexico talking there. He's trying to get the Pavlovian to think beyond the beyond just cause and effect. And that's why Pointsman retorts, no, not strike off, regress. You're 30 years old, man. There are no other angles. There is only forward, into it, or backward. So again, series, not parallel. We get this moment, page 154. It says, rainbowed Valkyrie over Pinamunda, and the V weapons, and then thus the angel was revealed. And here, Pynchon combines Norse mythology and the German rocket program. We have to remember that the Rainbow Bridge is the Bifrost, and that Rainbow Bridge takes us to Valhalla, or the Hall of the Gods. She, meaning Lenny Pokler, Franz Pokler's wife, she even tried, from what little calculus she'd picked up, to explain it to Franz at delta t approaching zero, eternally approaching, the slices of time growing thinner and thinner, a succession of rooms, each with walls more silver transparent as the pure light of the zero comes nearer. And again, I think I've worn this out by now, but it's so important. It's so important to so many of Pynchon's thoughts and symbols in here. They saw Die Frau im Monde. Again, you can go watch this on YouTube. Franz was amused, condescending. He picked at technical points. He knew some of the people who'd worked on the special effects. Lenny saw a dream of flight, one of many possible. Real flight and dreams of flight go together. Real flight and dreams of flight go together. Both are part of the same movement, not A before B, but all together. You must ask two questions. First, what is the real nature of synthesis? And then, what is the real nature of control? And again, these are the twin factors of the fascism and the juggernaut that is represented by they. These are the two factors, synthesis and control. Then the Germans dropped a rocket just down the street from the theater. So this is a doubling of the German theater. So this is stretching in one direction back to the front of the novel, and it's all theater, and again to the end of the novel when the rocket is poised in its last delta T above the Orpheus Theater. And now we go into the second part of the novel, Un Perm au Casino Hermann Göring, or a furlough at the Hermann Göring Casino. And we get this quote from the director to Fay Wray, who plays the lead in King Kong. And he tells her that you will have the tallest, darkest leading man in Hollywood. And he's talking about King Kong, of course. And this symbol and the racism that it points to, and more so the fear of the white people of black primitive virility as menacing, is all through here. And it's a deep criticism of racism. I don't think you could see it any other way. We have these echoes of the opening of part one. It says, the sun, not very high yet, will catch a bird by the ends of his wings, turning the feathers brightly there to curls of shaved ice. Remember the ice fields in the horizon he was seeing, and the sun that hasn't risen yet catching and illuminating the rocket vapor trail. Watches the amazing foreign morning, the ghosts of his breathing into it. Remember Prentice going, feeling first sun warmth, wanting a first cigarette, and perversely he waits for a sudden noise to begin his day, a first rocket. The great purple kite races cursing down 3 flights, out a door and onto a little terrace, just in time to see somebody hop over a stone balustrade and vanish into the upper half of a thick tree, growing up from somewhere below. Treat at last, cries Slothrop. I mean, all right, for context, Slothrop is chasing this figure through the casino, and then he sees the figure jump over into a tree, and he yells out, treat at last, instead of freed at last. Here is just, the great Pynchonian gag humor. He gets back to the casino just as big globular raindrops, thick as honey, begin to splat into giant asterisks on the pavement. This kind of makes me think of the snowballs have starred the sides of outhouses at the beginning of Mason and Dixon, inviting him to look down at the bottom of the text of the day where footnotes will explain all. He isn't about to look. Nobody ever said a day has to be juggled into any kind of sense at day's end. He just runs. So this is, again, Pynchon taunting us, sort of messing with us and almost daring us to try and find meaning, taunting us that there isn't any meaning to be found, no sense at the end of at day's end. The odds they played here belong to the past only. Their odds were never probabilities, but frequencies already observed. It's the past that makes demands here. It whispers and reaches after, and, sneering disagreeably, gooses its victims. Here's another Pynchonian groaner. So as the mustache waxes, Slothrop waxes the mustache. What's happening during all this time, by the way, is that Katya Borgesius is assigned to lead and guide Slothrop through all of his immersion into rocket knowledge at the Casino Ermanguring. That's what he's supposed to be doing. The White Visitation, of which ARF is a component, and thus Pointsman, they have assigned this to happen, to get Slothrop away and down in there to focus on rocket studies. Later on, in London, came the visit from the most ubiquitous of double agents, Sammy Hilbert Space, whom everyone had thought in Stockholm. Or was it Paraguay? Now, what's so funny is that the concept of a Hilbert Space from David Hilbert points to what we know as Heisenberg and indeterminacy, where you can't really pinpoint something. In this Hilbert space, one point is sort of everywhere. And that's why not only is his name an allusion, but it's the narrator's even saying everyone thought he was in Stockholm, or was it Paraguay? Because it's pointing to this fact that we don't know for sure where he was, the Hilbert space guy. We get this concept of a over its peak and down, plunging, burning toward a terminal orgasm, which is certainly nothing she can tell Slothrop. The terminal orgasm, wasn't there something in Infinite Jest about a fixed number of erections, or perhaps a fixed number of orgasms, and once it happened, it would be oblivion or something like that? There's a moment in the ARF facility where Pointsman works and has all of these different animals encaged for experimentation, where the animals start talking. Pynchon does this so well. I remember in Mason and Dixon, when the clocks start talking to each other, James Wood hated that moment. I thought it was high literary value. But here, all of a sudden, the animals start talking to each other, and they talk like tough guys from New York City or something. It's hilarious. It says, who hears the small animals in the cages as they mate, or nurse, or communicate through the gray quadrilles? Now, I love that he decided to say through the gray quadrilles, because what he's really talking about is the physical cages that they're in. He sees those quadrilles as gray, the cages are obviously gray, and it looks like graph paper. But think about what I read earlier from Weisenburger, where we know that Pynchon himself penned the first manuscript of Gravity's Rainbow on graph paper. And so you just have this moment where you can kind of jump into Pynchon's head while he's writing this, and he's picturing all these cages in a facility, and he's looking down at his graph paper, and he sees this perfect isomorphism. Now, right before we go into this absolutely horrifying scene that I will skip over because it haunts me, and I kid you not, after I read this scene for the second time, for a couple of weeks, I could not use the bathroom without thinking about it. And this is very disturbing. But we get sort of a warning here. It says that, as Brigadier Pudding is being led back to the room where Domina Nocturna, which is really Katya Borgesius dressed up, is going to enact this moment that basically is being used to psychologically punish Brigadier Pudding. He wants to be punished for the men who died under his watch in the First Great War. And boy, is this a way to do it. And in fact, it ends up leading to one of the very few deaths in the novel. It's still not shown to us. It's sort of off screen, if you will. But he dies of a massive E. coli infection, as he well should. But they walk through on their way to enact this ritual, and they pass an open copy of Craft Ebbing. And thanks to Weisenburger, we know that this is a book of studies about deviant sexuality. So it's foreshadowing what's to come, almost like a warning. And it says, above all, pain. What is pain? The clearest poetry, the endearment of greatest worth. And Proust talks about that, how pain silences all. You can't help but hear pain. You can't help but submit to pain. It cuts through everything, all of our defenses. And both Pudding and Katya Borgesius, they're both masochistic in their way, and they need that pain. That has become their neurosis. I love this. This is straight Pynchon. He just tells us, Slothrop's off the bed, halfway across the room with a soft off, one sock on and the other in his teeth. Now, if you read that too quickly, you might not catch what just happened there. With a soft off, that would be the opposite of a hard on. Because of Gravity's Rainbow, I now know about the phenomenon of the Brocken specter, which is this spectral phenomenon up in the Brocken in the mountains in Germany. And I had forgotten about this, that this is linked to Faust Part 2 as the very place where Walpurgisnacht, the pagan festival, takes place. And that is used for many different layers here in Gravity's Rainbow. I'm going to read this little bit, and it spans across 3 different paragraphs, but there's a style. There's the omniscient narrator flits from Tyrone Slothrop to a second level narrator to presumably a security guard, focalized through a security guard, and then back to Tyrone Slothrop. It says, death for millennia, concrete roads abandoned years ago, hairdos of the late 1930s, indole molecules, especially polymerized indoles, as in imipex G. M dash, new paragraph. Wait, which one of them was thinking that? Monitors, get a fix on it. Hurry up. M dash. Thinking that? So here we have the very thought police of George Orwell's 1984, apparently, where because Slothrop just had a thought of imipex G, which is very pertinent to the plot here, it has alerted some security guard, some monitor, something has gone off and alerted that very thought. So that is how deeply they are monitoring the Preterite and people like Slothrop. Then it cuts, but the target slips away. I want to read a little bit here that really gives a sense of the German rocket romanticism. In the guidance, this is what happened. A little pendulum was kept centered by a magnetic field. During launch, pulling G's, the pendulum would swing aft, off-center. It had a coil attached to it. When the coil moved through the magnetic field, electric current flowed in the coil. As the pendulum was pushed off-center by the acceleration of launch, current would flow. The more acceleration, the more flow. So the rocket, on its own side of the flight, sensed acceleration first. Men tracking it sensed position or distance first. So we're getting the 2 perspectives and the communication between rocket and men as rockets on the move. This is very complex rocket science. To get distance from acceleration, the rocket had to integrate twice. So again, here's the double integral, or the SS. Needed a moving coil, transformers, electrolytic cell, bridge of diodes, 1 tetrode, an extra grid to screen away capacitive coupling inside the tube, an elaborate dance of design precautions to get to what human eyes saw. First of all, the distance along the flight path. There was that backward symmetry again, one that Pointsman missed, but Katya didn't. A life of its own, she said. Slothrop remembers her reluctant smile, the Mediterranean afternoon, the peeling twist of a eucalyptus trunk, the same pink in that weakening light as the American officer's trousers Slothrop wore once upon a time, and the acid, the pungent smell of wet leaves, the current flowing in the coil past a Wheatstone bridge and charged up a capacitor. We've just gone from Slothrop remembering something to back to the rocket there. The charge was the time integral of the current flowing in the coil and bridge. Advanced versions of this so-called IG guidance integrated twice, so that the charge gathering on one side of the capacitor grew directly as the distance the rocket had traveled. Before launch, the other side of the cell had been charged up to a level representing the distance to a particular point out in space. Brinschluss, exactly here, would make the rocket go on to hit 1,000 yards east of Waterloo Station. At the instant of the charge B sub IL, accumulating in flight equaled the preset charge A sub IL. On the other side, the capacitor discharged. A switch closed, fuel cut off, burning ended. The rocket was on its own, or as Prentice thought of it in the opening episode, it goes pure ballistic. This is one meaning of the shape of the tunnels down here in the Mittelwerke. The tunnels in the Mittelwerke are shaped in a double integral. Another may be the ancient rune that stands for the yew tree, or death. The double integral stood in Etzel Olisch's subconscious for the method of finding hidden centers, inertias unknown, as if monoliths had been left for him in the twilight, left behind by some corrupted idea of civilization, in which eagles cast in concrete stand 10 meters high at the corners of the stadiums where the people, a corrupted idea of the people, are gathering, in which birds do not fly, in which imaginary centers far down inside the solid fatality of stone are thought of not as heart, plexus, consciousness. The voice speaking here, this is parenthetical, the voice speaking here grows more ironic, closer to tears, with which are not all theater, as the list goes on. And so we have this meta-narrator who jumps in and lets us know that, hey, by the way, this is what's happening to the voice of this narrator. It's getting more ironic and closer to tears, which are not all theater. And then we conclude this whole treatise of the double integral by saying the double integral is also the shape of lovers curled asleep, which is where Slothrop wishes he were now, all the way back with Katya, even lost as he might feel again, even more vulnerable than now. Oh, we're down in the Mittelwerke with all the rocket engineers, and I love their songs that they're all singing. One song goes, "There was a young fellow named Crockett who had an affair with a rocket. If you saw them out there, you'd be tempted to stare, but if you ain't tried it, don't knock it." Here's another deification of the rocket. Where have they come from, if not from the rocket which is to be? How do you presume to compare a number you have only derived on paper with a number that is the rocket's own? Okay, now this is a little complex. It attributes this from in an epigraph. It attributes this to Steve Edelman's book, The Tales of the Schwarzkommando. This is fictionalized. Steve Edelman is a fictional historian who has, put together this book called Tales of the Schwarzkommando, giving us all this history behind the Herero people from their oppression and near annihilation in 1904 by the Germans to now the Schwarzkommando, or the Black Command, led by Enzian. And they see the rocket which is to be, as this God, this divine power that's leading them to some form of salvation or maybe revelation. And that's the rocket that is to be is, of course, the quintuple 01, or the next tick up from the 5 zeros rocket. There may be no gods, but there is a pattern. Names by themselves have no magic, but the act of naming, the physical utterance, obeys the pattern. So this is repeated several times, this pattern of myth repeated. The history of the old Hereros is one of lost messages. And lost messages, distortion in communication channels. This is where Pynchon's romance with Norbert Weiner's cybernetic theory comes into play. We have this moment when Slothrop gets to experience the Brockenspector, something I would love to do. I would love to hike up into the mountains of Germany and go to the Brocken and see this specter. You can see really cool pictures of it through Google Images. Whether they're photoshopped or not, I don't know, but some of them are pretty eerie. As the sunlight strikes their backs, coming in nearly flat on, it begins developing on the Pearl cloud bank. Two gigantic shadows thrown miles overland, past Klostthal-Zelterfeld, past Sessen and Goslar, across where the river Lane should be, and reaching toward Weser. By golly, Slothrop a little bit nervous. It's the specter. You got it up around Greylock in the Berkshires, too. meaning it happens, the phenomenon happens there too. Around these parts, it is known as the Brachensgespenst. Cows. Big lummoxes splotched black and white. Black and white, huge, huge, huge symbols in this novel. Harnessed now for the plowing because German horses in the zone are all but extinct. And the zone is this contentious area of Germany and other European entities in post-war, as the Germans are defeated and partitioning is beginning. Will drudge with straight faces right on into minefields sown back in winter. The god-awful blasts go drumming over the farmland. Horns, hide, and hamburger come showering down all over the place, and the dented bells lie quiet in the clover. So this is Pynchon being both horrific and hilarious at the same time. He's talking about cows that would go walking into minefields and step on a mine, and the way that he puts it is that horns, hide, and hamburger come showering down all over the place, which just sounds hilarious, I guess, to sort of a demented mind. But then he says the dented bells lie quiet in the clover. So he ends it again on this poetic and poignant line. He has the capacity, Pynchon has the capacity for endless emotional range. It's really quite fascinating. Here we go with Heisenberg baked into this. The American vice of modular repetition, combined with what is perhaps our basic search, to find something that can kill intense pain without causing addiction. Boy, that's ever relevant. Results have not been encouraging. We seem up against a dilemma built into nature, much like the Heisenberg situation. There is nearly complete parallelism between analgesia and addiction. The more pain it takes away, the more we desire it. It appears we can't have one property without the other, any more than a particle physicist can specify location without suffering an uncertainty as to the particle's velocity, which is exactly the case behind the Heisenberg principle. About midway through the book, it says the name on the special pass that Slothrop has been given is Max Schleppzig. Slothrop, feeling full of pep, decides to pose as a vaudeville entertainer. Now, Max Schleppzig is also an actor that, and we'll start to learn how he figures into the Pöckler family and Margarita Erdmann. Only at moments of great serenity is it possible to find the informationless state of signal zero. So again, balancing between the 0 and the 1. This is where between the 0 and the 1, these are the antipodes between which Pynchon's mind roams endlessly. It's just this crazed imagination and this lunatic genius that sees 0, this state of being, of stasis, as I've said, this state of no movement, but also no information, none at all. It's complete oblivion. And we can approach the 0, but can we ever go beyond the 0? These are thoughts that Pynchon toys with. Spray feathered landward off the curls of the big breakers. Pöckler, billeted at a fisherman's cottage, came in from his evening walks behind a fine mask of salt. Lot's wife. What disaster had he dared to look back on? He knew. This is great. A fine mask of salt. That triggered an allusion to Lot. And, you can see that it did the same for Pynchon. I can't imagine that Pynchon had already designed this scene such that he was going to talk about the spray from the ocean forming a salt mask on, Franz's skin, and then think of, making that allude to Lot looking back and his wife turning into a pillar of salt. This has to be just incidental, and it's indicative of the fact that Pynchon's mind is so overflowing with encyclopedias of information, that these things are just coming naturally to him. And, it also, that allusion to, well, that explicit reference to Lot and his wife. And when they look back on Sodom and Gomorrah, which God told him not to do, Lot's wife turned to a pillar of salt. This is very much akin to the Orpheus myth with Orpheus and Eurydice, where Orpheus is allowed to go into the other world and retrieve Eurydice and bring her back up to the world of the living. They're told not to look back. Eurydice looks back. Orpheus comes back without her. He's sad, and eventually, he's torn apart into pieces, just as Slothrop will be. He wanted a modification worked into one rocket, only one. Its serial number had been removed and 5 zeros painted in. Pokler knew immediately that this was what Weissmann had been saving him for. This was to be his special destiny. And we know by the end of it, we realize that Weissmann has enlisted Franz Pokler. He's using him. He's baiting him with simulacra of his daughter Ilsa year after year to keep him going and doing what he needs to do to retrofit the fairing in the quintuple zeros rocket nose, such that there's an Imipex G, which is we're told it's an erectile plastic, to create a shroud for Gottfried to be fired inside this rocket. This is Gottfried's destiny. This is represents Blissero's destiny. It represents Franz Pokler's destiny. The 4 fins of the rocket made a cross, another mandala. And that's why some scholars refer to the shape of gravity's rainbow being that of a mandala. Number 1 pointed the way it would fly, that is north. 2 for pitch, 3 for yaw and roll. 4 for pitch. Each opposite pair of vanes worked together and moved in opposite senses. That is, opposites together. So again, this gets at, parallel, not series. Opposites together. A network of happenings, not cause and effect. It's a much more complex reality than we typically think. We get this episode where Dr. Pointsman has basically ordered a castration of Slothrop. He wants Slothrop castrated. I'm presuming that this is going to give him an artifact with which to more closely study, or to just end the shenanigans that are running him around in circles to begin with. But of course that is thwarted, and someone else is almost, or maybe is, castrated instead. That would be Major Dwayne Marvey, and it's because of the pig costume. So Slothrop, starting with Max Slepzig, he changes personas, let's say, or costumes, identities, I think something 7 or 8 times, from the Hermann Goering casino all the way through. And the pig costume, it has many, many different connotations wrapped up in it, but we're thinking of Plechazunga, which is a pagan pig god. But it is the fact that Major Marvey has put on this costume, and they're thinking it's Slothrop, and they're going after him to castrate him. There is a counterforce in the zone. Who was the Soviet intelligence man who showed up just before the fiasco in the clearing? We know that that's Chicherin. Who tipped the Schwartz commando off to the raid? We know that that is Slothrop. Who got rid of Marvey? Well, Slothrop, indirectly. And then finally we have the 4th part, the counterforce, which its epigraph is attributed to Richard M. Nixon, who shows up in here as Schlub, and it just says, what? It's perfect, just this bald admission of what is happening. So again, as with the opening section's beginning episode, we begin with a dream. For Slothrop knows it was a kazoo. By the time he's awake, the racket has faded in the morning. And racket here, I think, is pointing to the German word Raketen, or rocket. What he was really drawing was the A4 rocket seen from below, which in Pynchon's mind, he has made isomorphic the mandala that we talked about earlier and the bottom of a rocket. They map perfectly onto each other. Chiseled in the sandstone, he finds waiting the mark of consecration, a cross in a circle. And then he becomes a cross himself, a crossroads. He's lying one afternoon spread-eagled at his ease in the sun. Slothrop, as he disintegrates, as he's leading into his disintegration, or the Greek word sparagmos is used a lot, this entropic dissension of Slothrop and the novel itself. He is found in the Hars, lying spread-eagled, and he becomes himself the third level of isomorphism mapped onto the mandala and onto the rocket seen from below. And now in the zone, later in the day, he became a crossroad. After a heavy rain he doesn't recall, Slothrop sees a very thick rainbow here. A stout rainbow cock driven down out of pubic clouds into earth, green, wet, valleyed earth, and his chest fills and he stands crying, not a thing in his head, just feeling natural. So here we have a rebirth, nature's offspring from intercourse between the rainbow and the earth. But we also have the color version of the white phallus coming out of white pubic clouds that represents not the rebirth, but the destruction of Earth, the destruction of Hiroshima. That is the image that is devoid of color. Or is it? Is it devoid of color? Because we know that the rainbow represents the spectrum of light, and white is the combination of the entire color spectrum. There's something still on. Don't call it a war if it makes you nervous. Maybe the death rate's gone down a point or two. Beer in cans is back at last. And there were a lot of people in Trafalgar Square one night not so long ago. But their capital T, but their enterprise goes on. So we are all left in disarray, but their enterprise continues and only grows. Here's what I was talking about earlier, where there's this moment of real tenderness and feeling, the feeling of lost love between Roger Mexico and Jessica Swan Lake. But he, Roger Mexico, could never tell her all the rest. How many other living things, birds, night smelling of grass and rain, sunlit moments of simple peace, also gather in what she is to him, was. He is losing more than single Jessica. He is losing a full range of life, of being for the first time at ease in the creation. So Pynchon can do melodrama too. Here, what a detail. Soon there won't be enough food or coal in Germany. Potato crops toward the end of the war, for example, all went to make alcohol for the rockets. That matters more than sustenance for your citizens. Do you suppose something has exploded somewhere? Really? Somewhere in the East? And of course, we're hinting at both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here we go into the story of Byron the Bulb. We're talking about conspiracy, immortality, economic oppression, and connectedness. Byron is surveilled just like Slothrop and keeps evading them, providing the appearance of power to those who are in reality powerless. One way or another, these bulb folks are in the business of providing the appearance of power against the night, without the reality, meaning that they, capital T, they are assuaging us, the underlings, the masses, by making us think that we have power. For example, something as simple as the light bulb, Pynchon does all this research into General Electric and IG Farben and other conglomerates. It's really true, really real stuff that happened around the light bulb and against the tungsten flame and the socket, which is called in Germany for some inexplicable reason Mutter, or mother. And he uses this as to show us this conspiracy, this cartelized state of even light bulb manufacturing and dissemination, to give the masses this sense that we have at least some power. And this actually ties back into the sadomasochistic elements of the book, because there's this crazy notion that, crazy because interesting, not implausible crazy. But there's this notion that if sadomasochism is allowed in the private bedrooms of the masses, then that is a way in which we will get to feel power and feel in control. So really, they should try to discourage sadomasochistic practices as sexual, interfaces in among the masses. So the story of Byron the light bulb is not to be dismissed. This is, it's anthologized. It's the only thing Bloom really went into depth with all of Pynchon, just about, and especially with Gravity's Rainbow. He saw the Crying of Lot 49 as a great, perfect book. But Byron, the story there, I think, touches the heart of all of us. It's a story about death and about power and about what would really happen if we were immortal and didn't die. And it mixes in with the myth of Sisyphus. He's doomed to repeat his duties on and on forever, and to see people die and pass on, and to see that spark of life. But in the end, he grows to love his horrible condition. Let's keep going here. We're almost there. Page 680. Since the noon on the heath when the quintuple zero was fired. So we get from the Lüneburg Heath at noon, we start to get more information about that firing as we go on. But we have to question, what has this information really done for us and done for the characters who are seeking that information? They have their rocket all assembled at last. This is talking about the Schwarzkommand. Their single A4 scavenged all summer piece by piece clear across the zone from Poland to the Low Countries. By the time he's done, they will all know what the Schwarzschild was, how it was used, where the quintuple zero was fired from, and which way it was pointed. This apparently, this information, the Herero people of the Schwarzkommand, they believe that this information will empower them to some transcendence. We're not left with this explained completely, but it's their quest. We're finally told here in the disintegrating last film reels, where it literally simulates film reel starting to flip in the reel of the projector. And we're finally told some characteristics of Imipex G. Imipex G is the first plastic that is actually erectile. And in the closing pages, we get these capitalized letters, no, but then you never really thought it was, did you? Of course, it begins infinitely below the earth and goes on infinitely back into the earth. It's only the peak that we are allowed to see, the break up through the surface out of the other silent world. We're talking about a rainbow, of course. But notice there's still this concept of the other silent world. The fact that it's a circle. It's not just the parabola. It's not just the arc, but it's a closed circle all around the world. We only see in part and not in whole. Here's a groaner. Devotees of the I Ching, as I call it. I don't know if it's pronounced I Ching, but devotees of the I Ching who have a favorite hexagram tattooed on each toe, who can never stay in one place for long. Can you guess why? Because they always have I Ching feet. The quintuple zero is the womb into which Gottfried returns. Also the Kinderofen. And, there's been this, we know of this demented role-playing that Blicero and Gottfried and Katja Borgesius have been playing in Holland, where Blicero has been dressing up as a witch and is doing this perverted version of Hansel and Gretel, with Hansel as Gottfried and Gretel as Katja. But we see here that, in fact, in a way, that was preparing Gottfried for his role as being placed in a sort of oven, which is another meaning we can impart to that to that Imipex G womb in the quintuple zero rocket. So that's sort of a quick read through of my reading notes from start to finish. Everybody is trying to locate this quintuple zero and its escherat, its modification using this Imipex G. Everything in the novel revolves around the rocket. In the V2, Thomas Pynchon has found an incredible emblem for a novel like this, a novel of this ilk. There's nothing else like it. We've got all these people involved in it. We've got Enzian, Chicherin, those two are half-brothers, and Slothrop, all trying to locate at least parts of that rocket. We've got the Schwartz Commando behind Enzian. We've got Dr. Pointsman, and to a degree, Dr. Laszlo Yamf, surveilling Slothrop and others. Everything's interconnected. Pynchon, he's, of course, immersed in thought in his study of World War II, thermodynamics, rocket engineering, behavioral psychology, Teutonic mythology. He apparently has read the unabridged, complete writings of Grimm on Teutonic mythology, Jewish Kabbalah, tarot, astrology, statistics, military slang, witchcraft, Herero mythology, comic books, radio programs, Martin Fierro, and of course the V2 rocket. Gravity's Rainbow is one of my favorite novels, hands down. It's even more so my favorite now. I can say that the secondary literature has opened up new windows, has expanded my horizons of how I see this novel. Rereading it was a treat. There were many lunch breaks. Now that I'm slowly being brought back into the office, I'm getting back into my reading in my car on lunch break. And there were so many days when this was a highlight right in the middle, to be able to go and jump back into Gravity's Rainbow and read in my car there for an hour. It operates on so many different levels. It's really an endless book, a bottomless book. It's so many possibilities. Pynchon has been the master craftsman. It's really unthinkable that a human being could have produced something like this, but I will forever be grateful. In fact, now that within a year, I have reread The Recognitions, JR, Infinite Jest, and now Gravity's Rainbow. It's really a really difficult decision as to which is my favorite American novel of the 20th century. I felt pretty confident that it was The Recognitions, but now rereading The Recognitions last year and now Gravity's Rainbow this year, I think it may well be Gravity's Rainbow, an incredible book. I hope that I've given everyone who watched even pieces of this something to take away. Please hit the comments up, talk this book up, let me know where I'm wrong. People love to correct my pronunciations because I'm horrible at pronouncing things because I'm sort of purely a reader. I don't really listen to stuff. I don't listen to lectures much. I don't listen to audiobooks. So because I'm a silent reader, or reading aloud sometimes if it's poetry or the prose sounds really good, I come up with my own pronunciations. So have at me, do what you want to do there. Let me know what you think about Gravity's Rainbow. Again, I invite anybody who has links to podcasts, articles, essays, whatever, other books to consider, stuff that I missed, please fill it in. I hope you've enjoyed this video. And for someone who has actually watched the entire thing, wow, I commend you and I thank you. And I hope it was worth it. So I've told you everything that I can think of today with Gravity's Rainbow. Well, not everything, but everything that I could think of today. I'm sure in editing, I'll think of a million things that I overlooked. But now that I've shared my thoughts about Gravity's Rainbow, I'd love to hear from you. So let me invite you by saying, now everybody,